Picture this: you're standing in the middle of ancient Rome, surrounded by towering marble columns, the air buzzing with the sounds of merchants haggling and politicians debating. You've seen the movies, read the books, maybe even memorized a few Latin phrases, but here's the shocking truth. So much of what we believe about daily life in Rome is flat out wrong. Think gladiators were constantly battling to the death, that Romans spent half their day lounging in baths, or that everyone from senators to slaves spoke flawless Latin. Time to rewrite the history books, because today we're busting open 45 of the most stubborn myths about ancient Roman life, one jaw-dropping revelation at a time. This isn't just about setting the record straight. It's about stepping into the sandals of real Romans, uncovering the messy, fascinating, and often hilarious truths behind the legends. Imagine discovering that their orgies were more about political networking than wild parties, or that their famed military discipline had some shockingly chaotic loopholes. These myths didn't just pop up overnight. They've been shaped by Hollywood, misunderstood textbooks, and even ancient Roman propaganda itself. But here's the twist: the reality is even more intriguing than the fiction. So why does this matter? Because Rome wasn't just a city. It was a living, breathing experiment in human society, one that still shapes our world today. From their groundbreaking legal systems to their bizarre beauty standards, every myth we debunk pulls back another layer of a culture that's been misunderstood for centuries. By the time we're done, you'll see Rome in a whole new light, not as a polished Hollywood set, but as a place where real people lived, loved, and sometimes even faked their way through history. Ready to separate fact from fiction? Let's dive in. That flowing white toga you see in every Hollywood epic, turns out ancient Romans would have laughed at the idea of wearing it to the market or while doing chores. Think of it like a modern tuxedo reserved for special occasions, not something you'd throw on to sweep the floor. The truth is, togas were a nightmare to wear. They required layers of heavy wool, could stretch up to 20 feet in length, and took servants or skilled hands to drape properly. One wrong move, and you'd be tripping over your own dignity. So what did Romans actually wear day to day? Men typically threw on a simple knee-length tunic, just two rectangles of fabric sewn together with holes for the head and arms. It was the ancient equivalent of a t-shirt and jeans, practical, cheap, and easy to move in. Women wore stolas, long draped dresses belted at the waist, often with a shawl called a palla for extra warmth or modesty. And forget about vibrant colors unless you were wealthy. Your clothes were likely dull shades of brown, gray, or off-white, dyed with cheap materials like onion skins or walnut shells. Even the elite avoided togas unless absolutely necessary. Senators might grudgingly wear them for political speeches or religious ceremonies, but they'd change into something more comfortable the second they got home. There's even evidence that Emperor Augustus, frustrated by how few citizens wore togas to public events, tried passing laws to force people into them, with little success. The real kicker: many of those pristine marble statues that cemented the toga's legendary status were actually painted with bright colors originally, making them even less accurate to everyday life. This myth persists because art and propaganda elevated the toga as a status symbol, not because it reflected reality. Just like today's influencers might post photos in designer gowns while actually living in sweatpants, Romans used the toga to project an image, one that had very little to do with how they actually dressed. So next time you picture a Roman, imagine someone in a simple tunic, maybe stained with olive oil or wine, far more concerned with comfort than looking like a walking piece of sculpture. Gladiators fighting to the death in every match, that's pure Hollywood drama. The truth is, most gladiatorial combat was more like a high-stakes sporting event than a slaughterhouse. These fighters were expensive investments trained, fed, and maintained by wealthy owners who wanted a return on their money. Imagine paying top dollar for a star athlete, only to watch them die in their first match. Doesn't make much business sense, does it? In reality, many fights ended with one gladiator conceding defeat, often by raising a finger in surrender. Judges or referees frequently stepped in to stop bouts before they turned fatal, especially if both fighters were skilled and popular. Some matches even ended in ties, with the crowd cheering for both combatants to live another day. Deaths did happen, but they were the exception, not the rule, reserved for special occasions like imperial celebrations or executions of criminals forced into the arena. Gladiators were more than just disposable warriors, they were celebrities. The best fighters gained massive followings, with fans betting on matches and even buying merchandise like oil lamps carved with their faces. Some earned enough prize money to buy their freedom and retire comfortably. There are records of retired gladiators opening training schools or becoming bodyguards for the elite. The myth of constant bloodshed likely comes from Roman propaganda and later sensationalized stories. Emperors like Commodus, who fancied himself a gladiator, staged extravagant shows with more violence to impress crowds, but these were carefully orchestrated spectacles, not the everyday reality. Even then, skilled fighters were often spared because a dead gladiator couldn't draw crowds for the next event. So next time you picture the Coliseum, imagine the roar of the crowd not just for blood, but for skill, showmanship, and the thrill of a close match. The real story of gladiators isn't just about death. It's about survival, fame, and the surprising humanity behind the legend. Those lavish Roman banquets we see in movies, with tables groaning under roasted peacocks and wine flowing endlessly, were the ancient equivalent of a billionaire's Instagram feed, carefully curated to impress, but nothing like daily reality. For most Romans, dinner was a humble affair. A round of flatbread, a handful of olives, maybe some lentils or cheese if the budget allowed. The famous writer Pliny the Elder even boasted that Rome's early heroes lived on simple porridge, suggesting extravagance was a sign of moral decay long before Seneca started lecturing about moderation. The legendary multi-course feasts did exist, but they were exclusive parties for the elite, not weekly occurrences. Even wealthy families didn't eat like emperors every night. A typical upper-class meal might feature 3 modest courses, eggs or vegetables to start, fish or meat as a main, and fruit or nuts to finish. The truly outrageous banquets, the ones with dormice glazed in honey or live fish cooked at the table, were political theater. Hosts like Nero or Lucullus used them to flaunt power, not because they enjoyed eating flamingo tongues. And here's the twist: overeating was downright scandalous in many circles. Philosophers like Cicero mocked gluttony, calling it a vice of less civilized peoples. Stoics preached that lavish meals clouded the mind, while doctors warned rich clients that digestion worked best with small portions. There's even a story about Emperor Augustus, who supposedly preferred coarse bread and sardines to gourmet dishes, just to prove his humility. The myth of non-stop feasting comes from surviving texts that focused on the sensational no-one-wrote scrolls about a merchant's daily chickpea stew. But archaeology tells a different story. Excavations of Roman apartments reveal tiny kitchens with basic cookware, and garbage pits full of fish bones and fruit pits, not silver platters. Even the famed garum fish sauce, often portrayed as a luxury, was mass-produced in factories and sold cheaply in clay jars. So next time you imagine a Roman dinner, picture a family sharing a loaf of bread dipped in olive oil, not a never-ending buffet. The truth is far more relatable and in some ways more admirable. Their real culinary legacy wasn't excess. It was turning simple ingredients into enduring staples, from olive oil to wine, that still fill our pantries today. Latin might have been the official language of Rome, but walking through the empire's bustling streets would have sounded more like a modern-day airport than a Latin classroom. While we imagine toga-clad citizens reciting Virgil to each other, the reality was far messier and far more interesting. Greek was actually the lingua franca of the Eastern Empire, spoken more widely in cities like Alexandria or Antioch than Latin ever was. Even in Rome itself, you'd hear a cacophony of accents, slang, and regional dialects, with working-class neighborhoods developing their own colorful jargon that would have made Cicero blush. The myth of universal Latin comes from a quirk of history. The elite wrote everything down. Legal documents, epic poems, and political speeches were all in polished, formal Latin, the kind preserved on stone tablets and parchment. But just because something was carved in marble doesn't mean it reflected daily life. Imagine if future historians assumed everyone today spoke like Shakespeare because his plays survived, while text messages and casual conversations crumbled to dust. That's essentially what happened with Rome. Here's the twist: many Romans were functionally bilingual or even trilingual. Educated elites often spoke Greek fluently. It was the language of philosophy, commerce, and high culture. St. Augustine famously admitted he hated Greek as a student, which tells us it was still being taught centuries after Rome's peak. Meanwhile, in places like Judea, Aramaic dominated daily life, while Egypt had pockets of Coptic alongside Greek and Latin. Even the Roman army, that great engine of Latinization, was a linguistic patchwork. Soldiers from Gaul or Syria would have communicated in a rough and ready version of Latin now called Vulgar Latin, which eventually evolved into languages like French and Spanish. The real kicker: some emperors struggled with Latin themselves. Hadrian, one of Rome's most powerful rulers, reportedly spoke with a noticeable Spanish accent, while the Syrian-born emperor Elagabalus was mocked for his poor grammar. And let's not forget the graffiti in Pompeii, crude jokes, shopping lists, and love notes that reveal how ordinary people actually talked, full of misspellings and colloquialisms no textbook would ever teach you. This myth persists because language is often sanitized by history. What gets preserved tends to be the proper version, while the lively, messy reality fades away. But the next time you picture ancient Rome, don't imagine a chorus of perfect Latin orators. Think of a vibrant, multilingual world where a merchant might haggle in Greek, pray in Aramaic, and curse in his local dialect all before lunch. That's the true sound of an empire. Those grand Roman baths we see in films, steam rising from marble pools, crowds lounging for hours, weren't the universal spa days we imagine. While public baths were indeed social hubs, the idea that every Roman spent their afternoons scrubbing down is as exaggerated as a gladiator's Hollywood physique. Take Cato the Elder, the ultimate old-school conservative, who famously grumbled that baths were a corrupting influence, calling them a slippery slope toward laziness and moral decay. He wasn't alone. Many traditionalists viewed frequent bathing as a sign of weakness, something for the pampered elite, not hardworking citizens. Access was another huge divider. In bustling cities like Rome or Pompeii, baths were everywhere. Some estimates suggest over 900 in the empire at its peak, but rural communities often went without. For farmers and laborers living miles from the nearest town, a weekly splash in a river or a quick wipe down with a damp cloth was the height of hygiene. Even in urban areas, the poorest couldn't always afford the small entrance fee, let alone the extra cost for scented oils or a professional scrape down from a bath attendant. And let's talk about what clean actually meant back then. The wealthy might soak in perfumed waters and have slaves rub them with expensive oils, but the average bath-goer shared water with dozens of others, water that wasn't exactly changed after every use. Archaeologists have found drains clogged with everything from hair to broken wine bottles, and medical texts warn about infections picked up in public baths. The famed hygiene of Rome sometimes involved scraping dirt off with a curved metal tool, then jumping into a communal pool where the grime just floated around. The baths weren't just about washing, though. They were ancient networking centers, places to gossip, negotiate business deals, or even eavesdrop on political plots. Seneca wrote about trying to concentrate in his villa while noise from the nearby baths, the grunts of weightlifters, the splashes of divers, drifted through his windows. For every Roman who visited daily, there were others who avoided them entirely, whether out of modesty, frugality, or fear of the notorious pickpockets who prowled the locker rooms. So next time you picture Romans obsessively bathing, remember, their relationship with cleanliness was as complicated as ours. Some treated it like a ritual, others saw it as a luxury, and a few probably thought the whole thing was overrated. The truth isn't a scene from a sword and sandals epic. It's a mix of social divides, practical limitations, and the timeless human habit of turning even hygiene into a status symbol. The dramatic image of Rome collapsing in a single catastrophic moment, barbarians storming the gates, fires raging through the forum, an empire vanishing overnight makes for gripping storytelling, but it's pure myth. The truth is far more complex and in many ways more tragic. Rome didn't fall so much as it unraveled, thread by thread, over centuries of slow decay. Think of it like a towering oak tree rotting from within. By the time it finally toppled, the roots had been weakening for generations. Take that infamous date 476 AD, when the Germanic leader Odoacer deposed the last Western Roman emperor, Romulus Augustulus. It's etched in textbooks as the empire's end, but to most Romans alive at the time, it barely registered as a crisis. The Western emperor had been a figurehead for decades, his authority hollowed out by warlords and generals. Odoacer didn't even bother abolishing the title. He simply stopped appointing a new emperor and ruled Italy as a king, still paying lip service to the Eastern emperor in Constantinople. Life went on, taxes were still collected, roads were maintained, and senators held banquets in the same villas as always. The real collapse was a mosaic of crises piling up over 300 years. Inflation spiraled out of control after emperors debased the silver coinage to pay armies, turning coins into worthless copper slugs wrapped in thin silver foil. Plagues like the Antonine and Cyprian outbreaks wiped out millions, leaving farms abandoned and legions understaffed. The empire's vast borders became impossible to defend, with Germanic tribes not just invading but often being hired as mercenaries, only to turn on their employers when paychecks ran late. And let's not forget the civil wars, 26 emperors in 50 years during the 3rd century alone, many reigning for mere months before being assassinated. Here's the twist that shatters the myth completely. Rome never fully fell. The eastern half, which we now call the Byzantine Empire, thrived for another 1,000 years, preserving Roman law, art, and architecture while the West fractured into kingdoms. Constantinople stood as a beacon of Roman continuity until 1453, when Ottoman cannons finally breached its walls. Even then, refugees carried Roman knowledge to Italy, fueling the Renaissance. The so-called fall was really a transformation, a shifting of power, not an extinction. Why does this misconception endure? Because dramatic endings make better stories. Historians like Edward Gibbon, writing in the 18th century, popularized the idea of a grand, tragic collapse to fit their own narratives about moral decay. But archaeology tells a different tale. In places like Britain, Roman-style villas were still being built decades after the empire ended, while in Gaul, Latin evolved slowly into French without anyone noticing the exact moment it stopped being Roman. The lesson here isn't just about dates, it's about how empires actually decline. Not with a bang, but with a whimper as bureaucracies grow bloated, economies stagnate, and people gradually stop believing in the system that once seemed eternal. Rome's ghost lingered for centuries, and in some ways it never left us. Just look at the domes of Washington, D.C., or the Latin phrases in our courtrooms. The empire didn't so much fall as it quietly reshaped the world, one crumbling brick at a time. The fiery tales of Christians huddled in catacombs, constantly dodging Roman soldiers, make for dramatic storytelling, but history paints a far more complicated picture. While persecution did happen, it wasn't the relentless, empire-wide hunt we often imagine. Take Trajan, one of Rome's most pragmatic emperors, who famously wrote that Christians shouldn't be sought out actively, but if they were reported and refused to honor the state gods, then they could be punished. His stance, a bureaucratic shrug: don't go looking for trouble, but don't ignore it either. Here's the twist: for long stretches, Christianity was less a target and more an afterthought. Many emperors viewed it as a minor Jewish splinter group, odd, but hardly worth the effort of systematic suppression. Local officials often turned a blind eye unless public order was at stake. In places like Greece or Syria, Christian communities worshipped openly for decades without incident. The real danger came during times of crisis, when emperors needed scapegoats. Nero infamously pinned the Great Fire of Rome on Christians in 64 AD, unleashing brutal executions, but even that was less about religion and more about diverting blame from his own unpopular regime. The myth of non-stop persecution stems from later Christian writers who emphasized martyrdom stories to inspire the faithful. These accounts, while powerful, were selective. For every dramatic tale of lions and arenas, there were quiet periods where Christians held government jobs, owned property, and even mingled with pagan neighbors. Pliny the Younger, a Roman governor, wrote to Emperor Trajan in the early 2nd century, confused about what to do with Christians because they seemed harmless, just oddly stubborn about denying other gods. What really triggered crackdowns wasn't faith itself, but politics. Christians refused to participate in state rituals like offering incense to the emperor's statue, an act seen as treason, not heresy. When the empire felt secure, these snubs were tolerated. But during wars or plagues, when unity seemed vital, defiance became dangerous. Even the infamous Diocletian, who launched the last great persecution in 303 AD, initially left Christians alone for nearly 20 years before suddenly reversing course amid economic and military crises. The truth: most Romans found Christianity baffling, not threatening. Ordinary citizens often protected Christian neighbors during persecutions, and some governors dragged their feet enforcing anti-Christian laws. By the time Constantine legalized Christianity in 313 AD, many elite families had already quietly converted. The real story isn't one of constant terror, but of an empire reluctantly learning to live with a faith it couldn't fully understand until, eventually, it embraced it. Those iconic Roman roads stretching arrows straight to the horizon, turns out they had more twists and turns than a political scandal in the Senate. While Roman engineers certainly prized efficiency, the idea that every road was a geometric marvel ignores the messy realities of geography, economics, and downright human stubbornness. Take the famous Via Appia, yes. Its most photographed sections run straight as a sword, but venture further out and you'll find stretches that curve around hills, swerve to avoid marshy ground, or even detour abruptly to skirt some wealthy senator's vineyard. The military highways built for rapid troop movements came closest to the myth, engineered with near-obsessive precision. Surveyors used tools like the groma, a cross-shaped device for sighting lines, to plot these routes, sometimes tunneling through hills or bridging valleys rather than bend to nature's whims. But even these strategic roads had exceptions. When faced with the Apennine Mountains' rugged slopes, engineers often chose winding paths that followed natural contours rather than attempt impractical straight-line ascents. Local roads told a different story entirely. Rural routes connecting farms to markets meandered like lazy rivers, adapting to centuries-old property boundaries or sacred groves no farmer dared disturb. Archaeologists have found roads in Britain that zigzag inexplicably until they realize the path avoids an ancient Celtic burial mound the Romans pragmatically decided not to provoke. Even in cities, streets curved around temples or public squares preserved from pre-Roman times, revealing how the empire often layered its order atop existing landscapes rather than erasing them. The myth of perfect straightness stems from Roman propaganda celebrating engineering prowess. Emperors loved boasting about roads that conquered distance, while poets praised routes where no foot stumbles. But surviving road maintenance logs tell another tale: complaints about washed-out curves, petitions from merchants begging for safer switchbacks on steep grades, and even lawsuits when a new road's straight path sliced through someone's profitable olive grove. Perhaps the most ironic twist, some apparent detours weren't engineering compromises at all, but calculated power plays. When a road curved unnecessarily around a particular villa, it often meant the owner had bribed officials or was too influential to oppose. There's even a record of one furious landowner whose direct route was rejected because his rival had convinced the surveyors that a winding path would better showcase the countryside's beauty. The real Roman road network wasn't just about efficiency. It was a sprawling, living document of politics, pragmatism, and the occasional dose of bureaucratic pettiness, proving that even history's most disciplined builders sometimes had to take the scenic route. The idea that lead pipes turned ancient Rome into a society of chronically poisoned citizens sounds like a neat explanation for the empire's decline, but the truth is far less dramatic. Yes, Romans used lead in plumbing, but they weren't gulping down toxic cocktails with every sip. Here's why. Those infamous lead pipes quickly developed thick layers of calcium carbonate from mineral-rich water, effectively coating the inside and preventing most lead from leaching through. It's like how a tea kettle builds up limescale, annoying but ironically protective. Wealthy Romans barely drank from pipes at all. They preferred fresh water gushing from public fountains fed directly by aqueducts, where the constant flow prevented stagnation and further reduced any metal contamination. The poet Martial even mocked a friend for boasting about his fancy lead-lined water tank, joking that the man's wealth tasted metallic. Meanwhile, ordinary citizens often collected rainwater in ceramic jars or drew from wells, options that bypassed the plumbing system entirely. Modern science backs this up. Skeletal remains from Roman burial sites show lead levels higher than prehistoric Europeans, but lower than industrial-era factory workers. Some individuals, like a first-century gladiator tested in Vienna, had shockingly low lead concentrations. The real danger wasn't in the water supply, but in their cooking habits. Wealthy Romans loved sweetening wine with defrutum, a syrup made by boiling grape juice in lead pots, which could concentrate the metal to dangerous levels. Even then, not everyone indulged. The myth of universal lead poisoning gained traction because it offered a simple, technological scapegoat for Rome's fall. But blaming pipes ignores the empire's real resilience. Their water systems were so advanced that some cities, like Ephesus, still had functioning Roman aqueducts into the Middle Ages. The lesson here isn't about ancient negligence, it's about how even the smartest societies can have blind spots, prioritizing convenience over consequences in ways that feel uncomfortably familiar today. Julius Caesar's name is practically synonymous with the idea of Roman emperors, but here's the twist: he never actually held that title. The man who famously crossed the Rubicon and declared "Veni, Vidi, Vici" was a dictator, not an emperor, and that distinction matters more than you might think. Rome's imperial system, with all its pomp and hereditary rule, didn't exist until his adopted heir Augustus engineered it years after Caesar's assassination. So why does this mix-up persist? Blame 2,000 years of linguistic shorthand and Hollywood's love of collapsing timelines. The confusion starts with that loaded word, Caesar. In his lifetime, it was just a family name. The Julii Caesars were a respected but not extraordinary clan. After his death, though, it morphed into something far bigger. Augustus, keen to legitimize his power, kept the name as a political brand, and later rulers followed suit, turning Caesar into a title like Pharaoh or Tsar. Over centuries, the line between the man and the office blurred, until even historians started using Caesar as shorthand for any Roman emperor. It's as if future scholars referred to every U.S. president as Washington, technically wrong, but somehow sticky. Here's what gets lost in the shuffle. Caesar's Rome was still a republic in theory, however battered. His title was Dictator Perpetuo, dictator for life, a temporary emergency role twisted into permanence. Emperors, by contrast, wore crowns well, laurel wreaths, claimed divine connections, and passed power to heirs. Augustus didn't just inherit Caesar's name, he built an entirely new system, carefully avoiding his uncle's mistakes. Where Caesar flaunted his power, provoking assassins, Augustus pretended to restore the Republic while quietly controlling everything. The myth isn't just about semantics, it flattens a pivotal moment in history. Caesar's assassination wasn't the death throes of a monarchy. It was the last gasp of republicanism, the moment Rome realized it couldn't go back to the old rules. By the time Augustus finished his political makeover, the Republic was a nostalgic prop, and Caesar was no longer a man but an institution. That's why the mix-up matters. It erases the messy, fascinating transition between two worlds, turning a revolution into a simple name change. Next time you hear someone called Julius Caesar an emperor, remember, he was the spark, not the system. The real architects of imperial Rome were the survivors who learned from his fatal boldness and knew better than to call themselves kings. That legendary image of the Coliseum transformed into a giant naval battleground, with ships clashing and waves crashing against the arena walls. It's one of Rome's most enduring spectacles, and one of its most exaggerated. While the idea of flooding the Coliseum for epic sea battles or Naumatia captures the imagination, the reality was far less cinematic. Early historians like Cassius Dio did describe Emperor Titus flooding the arena for a reenactment of a famous Greek naval battle, complete with ships and condemned fighters. But here's the catch. Archaeologists have found zero physical evidence that the Colosseum could hold water on that scale. The logistics alone make it implausible. The Colosseum's hypogeum, that intricate maze of underground tunnels and cages, would have been ruined by flooding. This wasn't just a basement, it was the heartbeat of the games, housing gladiators, animals, and machinery. Submerging it would have taken weeks of preparation, not to mention the risk of structural damage from water pressure. Even with Rome's advanced aqueducts, filling an arena that large would have drained local reservoirs dry. And then there's the drainage problem. how do you empty millions of gallons of water without turning the surrounding streets into swamps? So where did these legendary naval battles actually happen? Likely in specially built basins or existing lakes. Emperor Augustus staged a naumatia on an artificial lake dug just for the occasion, featuring 30 ships and 3,000 fighters. Another took place on the Cuisine lake, where Claudius orchestrated a massive spectacle so grand, the historian Tacitus snarked that the participants saluted him with a chillingly rehearsed line before fighting. "Hail, Emperor, those about to die salute you." These venues made sense. They were already watertight, easier to fill, and didn't require retrofitting an iconic stone structure. The Coliseum myth persists because it fits our love of superlatives, the biggest, the boldest, the most impossible feats of engineering. But the truth reveals something even more fascinating. Romans didn't need to flood the Coliseum to prove their ingenuity. They built custom stages for different spectacles, treating entertainment like a traveling circus with specialized sets. The real marvel isn't a single arena doing everything. It's an empire so obsessed with spectacle that it engineered entirely separate venues just to satisfy a whim for aquatic drama. Perhaps the most telling detail, when the Colosseum did host water-themed events, they were probably small-scale mock battles in shallow pools, not ocean-going galleys. Imagine a glorified puppet show with miniature ships or fighters splashing in knee-deep water, more theater than warfare. It's a reminder that Roman spectacle was as much about illusion as engineering, and that sometimes the grandest myths grow from the smallest exaggerations. The Romans didn't invent concrete, they just made it legendary. Long before the Pantheon's dome defied gravity, Bronze Age builders were experimenting with primitive cement-like materials. Archaeologists digging through Minoan ruins on Crete found waterproof cisterns lined with a lime-based binder as early as 1800 BC, while the ancient Egyptians used gypsum mortar to hold pyramid stones together. Even the Greeks had their own early version, mixing volcanic ash from Santorini with lime to create a serviceable, if not spectacular, building paste. What set Rome apart wasn't the concept but the chemistry. Their game-changing ingredient was pozzolana, a volcanic ash from the region around Pozzuoli that reacted with water to form an exceptionally strong bond. This wasn't just better concrete, it was concrete that could harden underwater, allowing harbor walls to be built directly in the sea. The recipe was so effective that modern engineers still puzzle over its durability, especially when comparing it to crumbling 20th century bridges. The real Roman innovation lay in how they deployed this material. While earlier cultures used their rudimentary concretes for small-scale projects, Rome industrialized the process, building everything from aqueducts to apartment blocks with it. The Pantheon remains the ultimate flex, a dome spanning 142 feet, still the world's largest unreinforced concrete structure after 2,000 years. And here's the kicker, it gets stronger over time as rainwater seeping through the dome's pores reacts with the pozzolana, continuously forming new mineral bonds. But the myth of Roman invention persists because they left such an indelible mark. No earlier civilization matched their scale or ambition. When the Minoans mixed lime and clay, they made storage pits. When Rome combined pozzolana and rubble, they built an empire. The difference wasn't just in the materials, it was in the vision. Their concrete became more than mortar. It was the physical manifestation of Roman might, poured into every province from Britain to Syria. The lesson here isn't about who mixed the first batch, but how innovation builds on what came before. Rome didn't create concrete out of thin air. They took a good idea and forged it into something immortal. In that way, their greatest invention wasn't the material itself, but the audacity to use it in ways no one had ever dreamed possible. The Hollywood image of Roman slaves' bloodied backs, clanking chains, endless whippings misses one crucial truth. Slavery in Rome was a spectrum, not a monolith. While brutal conditions certainly existed, especially in mines or galleys, the reality was far more complex. Consider the case of Tiro, Cicero's enslaved secretary, who became so indispensable that the famed orator freed him and later collaborated with him as an equal. Tiro wasn't just literate, he invented a system of shorthand still used today, proving that some enslaved individuals held roles requiring elite education and trust. Household slaves in wealthy families often lived better than freeborn laborers. They dined on quality food, wore decent clothing, and slept in warmer quarters than the urban poor crammed into rickety insular apartments. Some even managed their masters' businesses or finances, wielding real influence. Medical texts from the era reveal enslaved doctors treating their owners' families, hardly a job given to someone deemed expendable. The poet Horace, himself the son of a freedman, wrote openly about his childhood tutor, a slave who taught him Greek literature and philosophy with the same rigor as any Athenian scholar. The harshest fates were reserved for those in extractive industries. Mining slaves, often prisoners of war, faced short, grueling lives in Spanish silver pits or Egyptian quarries. Galley rowers, sometimes chained to their oars, became symbols of suffering, but even here there were nuances. Archaeologists studying Roman shipwrecks note that some vessels show no evidence of permanent shackles, suggesting not all rowers were bound indefinitely. And in agriculture, while large estates like those described by Cotto the Elder could be ruthless, smaller farms often operated on a mixed labor system where enslaved and free workers toiled side by side. What made Roman slavery unique was its permeability. Manumission, the act of freeing slaves, was shockingly common compared to other slave-owning societies. Freedmen could become citizens, and their descendants faced no legal stigma. The Emperor Pertinax, who ruled briefly in the 2nd century, was the son of a freedman. This social mobility wasn't kindness, it was a calculated system. Promise of freedom incentivized obedience, while the threat of demotion to harder labor kept ambition in check. The misconception of universal brutality stems from conflating Rome with later Atlantic slavery systems. Romans saw slavery as a temporary misfortune, not an inherent racial condition. That doesn't excuse its horrors, but it does explain why a slave like Zeno could ascend to become a renowned Stoic philosopher, while another might perish anonymously in a mine. The real tragedy lies in this very variability, a system that could nurture talent like Tyro's while simultaneously grinding thousands to dust. It wasn't consistent cruelty that defined Roman slavery, but its chilling pragmatism. Rome's empire wasn't a monolith of marble-skinned Italians. It was a vibrant mosaic of cultures, languages, and ethnicities that stretched from Scotland's misty highlands to the sun-baked temples of Egypt. The idea that all Romans looked like the statues of Augustus or Cicero ignores the empire's greatest strength, its ability to absorb and elevate people from every corner of the known world. Take Septimius Severus, the emperor who ruled at the height of Rome's power, born in Leptis Magna, modern-day Libya, with Punic ancestry and a distinct North African accent that never fully faded, even after years in the Senate. His sister reportedly spoke Latin so poorly that it became a court scandal, proving that Roman-ness wasn't about bloodline but loyalty. Walk through the streets of 2nd century Rome, and you'd hear a symphony of accents, Gallic merchants haggling in Latin peppered with Celtic slang, Syrian sailors swapping stories in Aramaic, Greek philosophers debating in the shadow of Trajan's column. The army, that engine of assimilation, was even more diverse. Tombstones from Hadrian's Wall reveal soldiers from Morocco, Germany, and Armenia, all buried under the eagle standard. One particularly touching inscription commemorates Regina, a freedwoman from Britain's Catuvellauni tribe, whose Syrian husband carved her epitaph in both Latin and Pomeran script, a testament to how fluid identity could be. The myth of uniformity stems from a modern obsession with race that would have baffled the Romans. To them, barbarian was a cultural slur, not a racial one. It meant anyone outside Roman law and customs, whether they were blonde-haired Germans or dark-skinned Nubians. Citizenship granted to all free inhabitants of the empire in 212 AD by Emperor Caracalla, another African-descended ruler, wasn't about ethnicity but allegiance. A Spaniard like Seneca could become Rome's greatest philosopher. A Thracian like Maximinus Thrax could rise from shepherd to emperor. Even Rome's elite wasn't immune to this diversity. The Emperor Philip, nicknamed the Arab, came from a humble family in modern-day Syria. The Severan dynasty filled the palace with Berber and Syrian relatives, while Eastern cults like Mithraism and Isis worship swept through the capital. The poet Juvenal grumbled about the Orontes River flowing into the Tiber, complaining that Syrian customs were corrupting the city, proof that cultural blending wasn't always peaceful, but it was inevitable. The real marvel isn't that Rome tolerated diversity, but that it weaponized it. By offering upward mobility to conquered peoples, they turned potential rebels into stakeholders. A Gaul might start as a hostage in Rome, like the historian Tacitus's father-in-law Agricola, and end up governing Britain. This isn't to whitewash Rome's conquests. Their empire was built on violence and exploitation, but to recognize that their genius lay in making Roman an identity anyone could claim. The lesson for us isn't about ancient demographics. It's about how societies thrive when they see difference not as a threat, but as a source of strength. The Vestal virgins loom large in popular imagination. Pure white robes, sacred flames, and the terrifying threat of being buried alive for breaking their vows of chastity. But like so much about Rome, the reality was far more nuanced than the sensational stories suggest. While the grisly punishment did exist in theory, only a handful of Vestals ever faced it across 6 centuries of recorded history. The infamous execution method, being sealed in an underground chamber with a loaf of bread and a lamp, was less about piety and more about avoiding the spiritual pollution of spilling a priestess's blood. Even then, most violations were handled with discreet exile or symbolic rebukes. Take the case of Emilia, a Vestal accused in the 3rd century BC. Rather than immediate execution, she was given a chance to prove her innocence by performing a miracle with the sacred fire. When she succeeded, the charges evaporated. Contrast that with the scandal of 114 BC, when 3 Vestals were condemned simultaneously, not because of sudden moral panic, but because their families were embroiled in a political feud with the reformist Gracchi brothers. Their crimes conveniently emerged right as their relatives were blocking land reforms. The Vestals' real power made them targets. These women weren't just ceremonial figures. They held unique privileges like owning property, making wills, and testifying in court without oath. Their presence could legitimize treaties, and their word could pardon condemned prisoners. When the rebel general Sulla took Rome in 82 BC, he pointedly secured the Vestals' approval first, knowing their endorsement would calm the populace. Little wonder that accusations against them often coincided with power struggles. Even the burial punishment itself reveals layers of meaning. Ancient sources describe the condemned Vestal being dressed as a corpse and paraded through silent streets, a ritual mimicking funeral rites, not an execution. Some scholars argue these executions may have been symbolic, with the women quietly relocated afterward. The few confirmed cases, like that of Cornelia under Emperor Domitian, reek of political theater. Her trial featured the emperor himself as judge, and contemporary writers openly speculated it was a distraction from his unpopular wars. The myth of rampant executions persists because it fits a lurid narrative of Rome as a place of constant brutality. But the Vestal's true story is one of influence, not victimhood. For every accused priestess, dozens more wielded quiet authority for decades, their chastity vouched for by the very state that supposedly policed them so harshly. Their greatest threat wasn't lust, but the envy of men who resented women holding power no senator could touch. The image of a Roman emperor swigging straight wine from a golden goblet makes for dramatic cinema, but in reality, that would have been as shocking as watching a modern politician chug whiskey at a state dinner. To the Romans, drinking undiluted wine wasn't just excessive, it was downright uncivilized, a habit they associated with barbarian tribes and reckless drunks. Their preferred method, mixing 1 part wine with 2 or even 3 parts water, creating a milder drink closer to modern table wine than the fortified varieties we know today. This wasn't just about temperance, it was chemistry. Roman wine fermented differently than ours, often reaching alcohol levels around 15% or higher, with preservatives like resin or herbs adding bitterness. Dilution made it palatable, and sometimes they got creative. Seawater was a popular additive in coastal regions, lending a briny tang believed to aid digestion. Pliny the Elder praised wines from Crete mixed with brackish water, while elite households might stir in honey or spices for sweetness. Military camps even had specialized vessels called mulsum for blending wine with honey water, a proto-energy drink for weary legionaries. Strong, undiluted wine existed, but as medicine, not refreshment. Doctors like Galen prescribed small doses of unmixed wine as an anesthetic or antiseptic, much like whiskey in frontier hospitals. Poet Martial joked about a guest who demanded pure Falernian wine at a dinner party, only to be handed a tiny cup usually reserved for toothaches. Even Dionysus, the god of wine himself, was often depicted holding a cantharos, a 2-handled cup designed specifically for diluting wine with water. The myth of Romans guzzling pure wine likely stems from 2 sources: later medieval Europeans who drank stronger brews, projecting their habits backward, and Roman satirists exaggerating the excesses of fictional characters. Petronius Satyricon features the vulgar Trimalchio boasting about his undiluted vintages, but he's the ancient equivalent of a tacky billionaire showing off, not an average citizen. What's fascinating is how this practice reflected Roman values. Dilution was a social ritual, with the host controlling the mix to match the occasion's formality. Water-to-wine ratios were coded language. A philosopher's symposium might serve lightly spiced, heavily watered drinks to keep conversations sharp, while a rowdy harvest festival could edge toward stronger blends. The real takeaway: Romans saw wine as a connector, not an intoxicant, a shared experience where moderation wasn't virtue, but simple common sense. So next time you picture a Roman banquet, forget the Hollywood debauchery. Imagine instead a gathering where the wine's strength was measured not by its punch, but by the quality of the conversation. It inspired a tradition that might make even our modern sommeliers pause. By the time Augustus declared himself first among equals, Rome's Senate had already begun its slow transformation from a governing body to a political prop. The marble halls where Cicero once swayed votes with fiery speeches became little more than a stage for imperial theater. Senators still dressed in their white togas with purple stripes, debated policy with practiced eloquence, and went through the motions of voting. But the real decisions happened behind palace doors, where emperors consulted military advisors and freedmen bureaucrats. This wasn't some sudden coup, it was death by 1,000 cuts. Early emperors like Tiberius and Claudius still played the republican game, pretending to defer to senatorial approval. But the writing was on the wall when Caligula made his horse Incitatus a senator, not because he actually let the animal vote, but because the joke revealed how hollow the institution had become. By the reign of Domitian in the late 1st century, senators needed imperial permission just to leave Rome, and their once sacred right to mint coins had long been transferred to imperial mints. The military's growing influence sealed the Senate's fate. When legions in the provinces began declaring their own emperors during the 3rd century crisis, the Senate's approval became an afterthought, a ceremonial stamp on decisions made at sword point. Emperor Aurelian barely consulted them before building his massive walls around Rome, while Diocletian's administrative reforms reduced the Senate to little more than a city council for the capital. Yet here's the twist: the Senate never fully lost its mystique. Even powerless, it remained a coveted club. Emperors from Vespasian to Constantine still sought senatorial titles for legitimacy. The institution outlasted the Western Empire itself, with senators still meeting in Rome as late as 603 AD, long after real power had shifted to Constantinople. Their stubborn persistence proves that in politics, sometimes the illusion of tradition matters more than the reality of power. The lesson isn't just about ancient history, it's about how institutions fade. Not with dramatic abolishment, but through gradual irrelevance, as old forms are kept alive long after their substance has drained away. The Senate's marble benches still gleamed, its rolls still bore illustrious names, but the empire had moved on, leaving it as a beautiful relic of a bygone age. The idea that every gladiator was a shackled slave forced into the arena is one of Rome's most persistent myths, but the truth is far more surprising. While slavery was certainly a path to the sand, many fighters stepped into the arena willingly, trading blood for glory and gold. Take the case of Spiculus, Emperor Nero's favorite gladiator, who amassed such wealth and fame that when Nero faced overthrow, he allegedly begged Spiculus to kill him rather than face his enemies. This wasn't a desperate slave, it was a celebrity athlete with the emperor's favor. Free men signed gladiator contracts for the same reasons modern athletes join risky sports: money, prestige, and adrenaline. Skilled fighters could earn purses rivaling a soldier's annual pay in a single match, with bonuses for crowd-pleasing performances. Some even negotiated clauses allowing them to keep prizes or earn freedom after a set number of fights. The poet Martial wrote of a freeborn gladiator named Hermes, who became so popular that fans carved his name into pottery shards as keepsakes, ancient merchandise for a star. The slave gladiator stereotype took root because Roman elites found the idea of free men choosing combat distasteful. Seneca sneered at volunteers as men who sell their honor, while satirists like Juvenal mocked bankrupt nobles who turned to the arena rather than live modestly. But tombstone inscriptions tell a different story. One from Pompeii memorializes a free gladiator named Marcus Attilius, who won his first match against a veteran champion, proof that talent could trump social status. Even enslaved gladiators had more agency than we assume. Successful fighters often kept a share of their earnings, and some, like the famed Flamma, turned down freedom 4 times, preferring the fame and steady income of the arena. Contracts found in Pompeii reveal gladiators could sue their trainers for unfair treatment, and medical records show they received better care than common slaves. After all, a wounded fighter was a wasted investment. The real tragedy lies in how this myth flattens the complexity of gladiatorial life. These weren't just victims or brutes, they were athletes, entrepreneurs, and sometimes even artists. The next time you picture the Coliseum, Remember the freeborn fighter who chose the roar of the crowd over the silence of obscurity, proving that in Rome's brutal theater, ambition could be just as powerful as any whip. The gleaming statues of emperors and Hollywood epics have cemented the idea that Rome was always ruled by a single all-powerful figure. But for nearly half a millennium, the city thrived as a complex republic where power was fiercely contested in the halls of the Senate, not inherited in palace coups. That famous acronym SPQR Senatus Populus Romanus, the Senate and people of Rome, wasn't just propaganda. It reflected a genuine, if messy, system of shared governance. While Julius Caesar's name now overshadows the era, his rise only marked the Republic's violent endgame after centuries of evolution. The early Republic structure would feel oddly familiar to modern democracies. Two consuls elected annually held executive power with a built-in check. Neither could act without the other's agreement. The Senate, composed mostly of wealthy patricians, debated policy, while assemblies of citizen soldiers voted on laws and war declarations. Even the office of dictator existed as a temporary emergency measure, limited to 6 months until Caesar shattered that norm. This wasn't just theoretical. When the patrician class hoarded power, plebeians staged mass protests in 494 BC, winning their own representatives, the tribunes who could veto unjust laws. What made Rome's republic revolutionary was its blend of pragmatism and idealism. The cursus honorum, a ladder of political offices, required elites to prove themselves in lower roles before seeking higher ones, mixing merit with aristocracy. Cicero, the Republic's greatest orator, rose from provincial obscurity to consul by skill alone, boasting that his new man status proved the system's openness. Yet corruption festered beneath the surface. By the 1st century BC, populists like the Gracchi brothers were murdered for advocating land reform, while generals like Marius and Sulla turned legions into private armies, proving how easily institutions crumble when ambition overrides rules. The myth of eternal emperors obscures Rome's most enduring legacy, its republican DNA. America's founding fathers modeled the Senate's name and checks on power directly from Rome, while the French Revolution's Senate and modern terms like senior and patrician all trace back to this era. Even Rome's imperial period couldn't erase the Republic's shadow. Emperors from Augustus to Marcus Aurelius paid lip service to senatorial authority, knowing legitimacy required maintaining the illusion of continuity. The tragic irony, the Republic fell not from external invasion but from internal contradictions. As Rome's territory expanded, its systems failed to adapt. Provincial governors grew rich exploiting conquered lands, while landless veterans flocked to warlords promising reform. By the time Augustus staged his restoration of the Republic in 27 BC, the institutions were already hollow shells. Yet the dream lived on. When Machiavelli wrote his discourses on Livy centuries later, he wasn't praising emperors but reviving republican ideals buried under imperial pageantry. This misconception matters because it flattens Rome's political imagination into a single autocratic stereotype. The Republic's real lesson isn't about its collapse, but about how long it endured despite human frailty. A 500-year experiment in shared power whose echoes still shape how we debate democracy today. Next time you see SPQR etched on a manhole cover in modern Rome, remember, those letters once stood for something far more radical than empire. They were a promise that no one, not even Caesar, should rule forever. The gleaming public toilets and towering aqueducts might suggest the Romans were obsessed with cleanliness, but their concept of hygiene would baffle modern scientists. While they engineered marvels like the Cloaca Maxima, one of history's earliest sewer systems, their understanding of germs was practically non-existent. A Roman surgeon might boil his instruments to honor Asclepius, the god of medicine, while never connecting sterilization to infection rates. This paradox, advanced infrastructure paired with biological ignorance, shows how their cleanliness rituals were more about ritual than science. Take their famous public latrines, where citizens sat shoulder to shoulder on marble benches with sponge-tipped sticks for cleaning. The running water below seemed progressive, but the shared sponges, dipped in vinegar between uses, were breeding grounds for bacteria they couldn't see. Medical texts like those of Galen praised frequent washing, but their reasoning was off. They blamed bad air or imbalances in bodily humors for illness, not microscopic pathogens. Even the wealthy who bathed daily might eat with unwashed hands, unaware that their perfumed oils did nothing to kill germs. The baths, often hailed as temples of hygiene, were really social hubs with a side effect of cleanliness. A Roman might spend hours scraping sweat with a strigil, then rub scented olive oil into their skin, a process that removed dirt but left a greasy layer trapping bacteria. Archaeologists have found combs lice still cling to, and letters complaining about itchy scalps, proving that personal grooming didn't always equal sanitation. Poet Marshall once joked about a man who smelled like the baths, not fresh but pungent from crowded, poorly drained pools, yet their instincts weren't entirely wrong. Frontinus, Rome's water commissioner, bragged about aqueducts delivering pure water from mountain springs, unknowingly avoiding contaminants that plagued stagnant sources. Doctors observed that wounds cleaned with vinegar or wine healed better, though they credited the substance's strength rather than their antiseptic properties. Even the Roman military's insistence on latrines dug downstream from camps showed pragmatic, if incomplete, hygiene. The real lesson here isn't about ignorance, it's about how culture shapes cleanliness. Romans associated foul smells with disease, so they prioritized odor control over sterilization. Their sewers were as much about civic pride as health, just as their baths were about networking as much as washing. In a world without microscopes, their efforts were remarkably logical and sometimes accidentally effective. Next time you admire their engineering, remember, even brilliance has blind spots, and the cleanest societies can't outthink what they can't yet see. The legend of Rome's invincible legions marching in perfect formation, crushing every enemy in their path, ignores the empire's most humbling moments. For every Caesar conquering Gaul, there's a Varus losing 3 entire legions in the Teutoburg forest's muddy traps. The truth, Rome's military genius wasn't about never losing. It was about learning how to lose and come back stronger. Take Cannae in 216 BC, where Hannibal's Carthaginians encircled and slaughtered up to 70,000 Romans in a single day. It remains one of history's worst defeats, yet Rome didn't surrender. They rebuilt, adapted, and ultimately wore Hannibal down through sheer resilience. The Teutoburg disaster in 9 AD was even more shocking. Germanic tribes led by Arminius ambushed 3 legions in dense woodland, killing 20,000 soldiers and leaving Augustus to wander his palace crying, "Varus, give me back my legions." This wasn't just a battlefield loss, it shattered Rome's myth of inevitable expansion. They never seriously tried to conquer Germania again, settling instead for fortified borders. And at Adrianople in 378, Gothic cavalry annihilated Emperor Valens and 2/3 of his army, exposing the legion's growing vulnerability to mobile, unconventional foes. What made Rome formidable wasn't perfection, but plasticity. After Cannae, they abandoned traditional tactics, adopting Hannibal's own maneuvers to outflank him. Post-Teutoburg, they invested in better reconnaissance and local diplomacy. And though Adrianople marked the beginning of the end for the Western Empire, it spurred reforms like heavier cavalry that kept the East alive another 1,000 years. Even their equipment evolved. The iconic rectangular scutum shield gave way to rounder designs better suited for fighting cavalry, while the rigid legion structure flexed to incorporate more specialized units. The myth of invincibility persists because Rome's successors, from medieval kings to Napoleon, wanted to emulate their glory, not their failures, but the real lesson is in their response to catastrophe. When Crassus lost his standards to the Parthians at Carrhae, Augustus later negotiated their return through diplomacy rather than force. After the Dacian Wars, Trajan's column depicted Roman soldiers being wounded and dying, a startling honesty about sacrifice. Their greatest strength wasn't an unbroken win streak, but the institutional memory to turn disasters into doctrine. So next time you picture the legions, don't imagine an unstoppable machine. Think of a force that bled, retreated, and sometimes ran, but always studied its scars. The Roman army's true legacy isn't invulnerability. It's the gritty determination to rewrite the playbook when the old ways failed. That's how empires endure, not by never falling, but by learning how to rise. The bloodthirsty tyrant has become the default image of a Roman emperor, thanks to legends about Caligula making his horse a senator or Nero fiddling while Rome burned. But history reveals a far more nuanced reality. For every madman like Commodus, there was a ruler like Marcus Aurelius, who penned philosophical meditations on justice between military campaigns. The so-called five good emperors, Nerva, Trajan, Hadrian, Antoninus Pius, and Marcus Aurelius, ruled for nearly a century from 96 to 180 AD, proving that imperial power could coexist with wisdom and restraint. Take Antoninus Pius, whose 23-year reign was so peaceful that historians struggle to find major conflicts to document. He reformed laws to protect orphans, built aqueducts instead of palaces, and left the treasury overflowing, all while refusing to execute senators or purge rivals. Hadrian spent half his reign traveling the empire, personally inspecting provinces and commissioning infrastructure projects from Britain's Wall to Athens' Grand Library. These weren't weak rulers, they simply understood that stability bred prosperity better than terror ever could. Even emperors with mixed legacies defy simple labels. Augustus, while consolidating absolute power, meticulously preserved republican facades to avoid appearing like a king. Vespasian, a gruff military man, restored Rome's finances through sensible taxes rather than confiscations, joking on his deathbed, "I think I'm becoming a god." Contrast them with true outliers like Caligula, whose 4-year reign of caprice, reportedly declaring war on Neptune and ordering troops to collect seashells as spoils, was shocking precisely because it violated generations of imperial norms. The myth of universal tyranny stems from ancient biographers like Suetonius, who prioritized salacious gossip over balanced analysis. When Cassius Dio wrote that Commodus fought gladiators in the arena, he failed to mention that senatorial historians despised him for sidelining their class, while the common people often cheered his spectacles. Modern archaeology reveals subtler truths. Coins minted under mad emperors like Elagabalus still paid soldiers on time, and provincial governors kept administrations running smoothly despite chaos in Rome. The real surprise, some of Rome's worst rulers inadvertently strengthened institutions. Nero's excesses led to the Year of the Four Emperors, which ultimately produced Vespasian, a reformer who stabilized the empire. Even the erratic Caracalla, best known for murdering his brother, granted citizenship to all free inhabitants of the empire, expanding the tax base and legal protections. The throne magnified personalities but didn't create them. A Marcus Aurelius or a Caligula brought their character to power, not the other way around. What makes the good emperors remarkable isn't just their virtue, but their context. They governed within systems that rewarded moderation. The Senate still held influence, the military expected competence, and the urban populace could riot if pushed too far. The empire worked best when emperors treated it as a responsibility rather than a playground. That delicate balance, not random luck, explains why Rome's golden age lasted generations, and why its collapse came when later rulers forgot those lessons. Those legendary Roman banquets overflowing with roasted peacock and stuffed dormice weren't grocery lists, they were ancient flexes, the equivalent of a modern billionaire posting caviar-stuffed gold leaf tacos on Instagram. For every elite gourmand slurping sea urchin roe, there were thousands of ordinary Romans surviving on pulse, a bland porridge of boiled wheat or spelt that even Cato the Elder called the glue that holds the republic together. Excavations of working-class neighborhoods revealed diets shockingly heavy on bread, lentils, and cheap fish sauce, with meat appearing only during festivals or if a family scraped together coins for a scrawny chicken. The exotic dishes we associate with Rome were political theater, not pantry staples. When Emperor Elagabalus served camel's heels and parrotfish tongues, he wasn't satisfying hunger, he was broadcasting wealth so extravagant it bordered on satire. Even Petronius' fictional Trimalchio, the ultimate vulgar nouveau rich host, knew these foods were props. His infamous dormice rolled in honey and poppy seeds weren't about taste, but about proving he could afford chefs who'd waste hours on such frivolities. Meanwhile, a soldier's pay slip found at Vindolanda reveals his shopping list: bacon, cheese, and sour wine, no mention of flamingo. Archaeology paints a vivid picture of everyday eating. Carbonized bread loaves from Pompeii show coarse bran mixed with whatever flour was cheapest, while garbage pits in Ostia contain endless olive pits and fish bones from small, bony species the rich disdained. Medical texts recommend barley gruel for strength, and soldiers' rations centered on hardtack and salted pork. The poet Juvenal sneered that the urban poor lived on stinking porridge and rotten vegetables, their only luxury being the free grain dole that kept them just fed enough not to riot. Yet there's a twist to this class divide. Some peasant foods became elite status symbols over time. Cato's beloved pulse was rebranded as rustic chic by later generations nostalgic for Rome's austere past. Emperors like Augustus staged public meals of simple fare to seem relatable, even as they privately indulged, and that garum fish sauce drowning elite dishes. It started as a practical preservative for fishermen, only becoming gourmet when aged like fine wine and spiked with expensive spices. The real culinary legacy of Rome isn't found in those absurd banquets, but in the durable, humble staples that crossed class lines: olive oil drizzled on bread, lentils simmered with garlic, and wine watered down for daily drinking. These weren't just stomach fillers, they were the edible foundation of an empire, fueling everyone from legionaries on the frontier to clerks in the forum. Next time you picture a Roman meal, forget the dormice. Imagine a bustling apartment where the smell of baking flatbread mixes with the tang of cheap wine, proving that sustenance, not spectacle, truly built civilization. When we picture the Circus Maximus, our minds flood with images of thundering chariots, Ben-Hur-style crashes, and roaring crowds. But this iconic arena was Rome's original multi-purpose stadium, hosting everything from Greek-style foot races to elaborate religious pageants. Chariot races may have been the headline act, but the circus was as versatile as a modern sports complex, its sands trodden by athletes, actors, and even sacred processions. Think of it less like NASCAR and more like a cross between the Olympics, Broadway, and a mega church revival. Athletic competitions were a surprising staple. Long before the Coliseum dominated gladiatorial combat, the Circus Maximus hosted track and field events modeled on the ancient Greek Olympics. runners competed in foot races stretching the length of the arena about 600 meters, while jumpers and discus throwers performed in the infield. These games weren't just for show. They dated back to Rome's earliest days, when legendary kings like Tarquin the Elder supposedly organized races to honor the gods. By the imperial era, athletics shared the calendar with chariot events, especially during major festivals like the Ludi Romani, where citizens expected days of varied entertainment. The circus also doubled as Rome's largest open-air theater. Playwrights like Livius Andronicus staged tragedies and comedies on temporary wooden platforms erected in the arena, though actors had to compete with the crowd's impatience for bloodier spectacles. There's a hilarious account of one performance where the audience, bored by a slow-moving play, suddenly erupted into cheers not for the actors, but for a spontaneous fistfight that broke out among vendors in the stands. Even sacred dramas found a home here, with priests reenacting myth using elaborate floats and costumes during religious festivals. Religious ceremonies transformed the circus into a spiritual hub. The annual Equirria festival dedicated to Mars featured horseback races in the arena, while the October horse ritual saw charioteers battle for the right to sacrifice a winning steed to the war god. Most striking were the Pompa Circenses grand parades, where statues of deities were carried through the arena on ornate floats, accompanied by priests and musicians. These weren't sidelined events, they were central to Roman identity, blending devotion with spectacle in ways that would feel alien to modern secular stadiums. The myth of the circus as a chariot-only venue stems from its later reputation. By the imperial peak, races had indeed become the main draw, with factions like the Blues and Greens whipping the populace into frenzies. But even then, the space remained fluid. Emperors like Nero repurposed it for his infamous public performances, where he sang and raced chariots himself badly, according to critics. After Rome's fall, the circus's legacy lived on. Its oblong shape inspired medieval jousting lists, proving its adaptability outlasted the empire itself. What makes this misconception so revealing is how it mirrors our own modern venues. We don't assume Madison Square Garden only hosts basketball, or that Wembley Stadium is solely for soccer, yet we've reduced the circus to a single function. In truth, it was a cultural chameleon, reflecting Rome's ability to weave sport, art, and worship into the fabric of daily life. The next time you imagine its stands, don't just hear the clatter of hooves, listen for the poet's verses, the athlete's grunts, and the hymns echoing off the turning posts, all part of the symphony that made Rome's greatest stage come alive. Roman women couldn't cast votes or stand for consul, but dismissing them as powerless ignores the shrewd ways they navigated a system designed to exclude them. Take the business-savvy Eumatia, a wealthy entrepreneur in Pompeii who funded public buildings and controlled a thriving brickworks, her name still etched on monuments alongside male patrons. Or Terentia, Cicero's formidable wife, who managed his estates, negotiated loans, and even influenced his political decisions despite never stepping foot in the Senate. These weren't exceptions, they were proof that Roman women turned legal limitations into opportunities for influence. The law technically barred women from formal politics, but it didn't stop them from pulling strings behind the scenes. Agrippina the Younger, mother of Nero, didn't need a title when she could manipulate imperial succession, engineering her son's rise while ruling as de facto co-emperor until he famously turned on her. Even ordinary women wielded economic clout. Grave inscriptions reveal female merchants trading spices from Alexandria, shipowners financing cargo fleets, and doctors like Matilia Donata practicing medicine with official approval. A divorce receipt from Egypt shows one woman, Dionysia, reclaiming her entire dowry plus interest, proving courts upheld their financial rights. Marriage was another loophole. While husbands held nominal control over dowries, smart women used them as leverage. Threatening to withdraw funds could make even the sternest patriarch reconsider his decisions. Sulpicia's poetry offers a rare glimpse into elite wives' private power. Her verses mock men who underestimated their intellect, while legal tablets from Herculaneum show widows like Calatoria Themis suing male relatives to protect inheritances. The infamous Valeria Messalina, often reduced to a scandalous caricature, was likely a political operator whose alleged excesses were exaggerated by historians uncomfortable with her overt authority. The real surprise: some religious roles gave women official authority no man could touch. Vestal virgins could pardon condemned prisoners, testify without oath, and own property independently, privileges even senators envied. The priestesses of Isis presided over rites that crossed class lines, their temples serving as hubs for women's social networks. When Augustus passed laws punishing adultery, it sparked protests led by matrons who understood the hypocrisy. Their husbands faced no consequences for the same behavior. This myth persists because ancient male historians focused on what women couldn't do, while archaeology reveals what they actually did. Scrolls from Roman Britain list female moneylenders charging interest, and Pompeii's walls bear election endorsements written by businesswomen for male candidates they backed. The glass ceiling was real, but Roman women found cracks in it, whether through wealth, wit, or sheer force of personality. Their legacy isn't just about rights denied, but about the ingenious ways they turned societal margins into spaces of real power. Rome's religious landscape was as diverse as its empire, far from a monolithic worship of Jupiter and Mars. While the state promoted the Olympian gods as imperial symbols, ordinary Romans blended local traditions with imported cults in ways that would have shocked purists. Take the Temple of Sulis Minerva in Bath, England, where Celtic pilgrims left curses scrawled on lead tablets, invoking both the Roman goddess of wisdom and the native spirit of the thermal springs. This wasn't cultural replacement, it was spiritual improvisation where deities merged like languages, creating hybrid beliefs as practical as they were profound. The empire's eastern provinces especially embraced this flexibility. In Egypt, Isis, once a pharaonic goddess, became a universal mother figure, worshipped from Londinium to Damascus, her temples offering initiation rites promising personal salvation. Soldiers stationed along Hadrian's Wall celebrated Mithras in underground shrines, sacrificing bulls beneath frescoed stars while reciting Persian hymns adapted with Roman military jargon. Even the sun god Sol Invictus, later adopted by Emperor Aurelian as Rome's chief deity, was actually a Syrian import, his birthday festival on December 25th, eventually repurposed by Christianity. Monotheistic ideas gained traction long before Constantine converted. Philosophers like Seneca wrote of a single divine force behind all gods, while mystery cults offered intimate relationships with specific deities. The poet Juvenal mocked Romans who prayed to nothing but clouds and celestial harmony, showing how abstract spirituality coexisted with traditional rites. When Christianity emerged, it wasn't invading a pagan monolith. It was competing in a crowded marketplace of faiths, each offering different paths to meaning in an unstable world. What makes this misconception so revealing is how it mirrors modern assumptions about religious conformity. Just as today's believers might blend yoga with church-going or astrology with science, Romans saw no contradiction in honoring Mars before battle, pouring libations to household spirits at meals, and attending secret Mithraic rituals on weekends. Their religion wasn't a checklist of dogmas, but a living conversation, one where a senator could champion Jupiter's supremacy by day and whisper prayers to Isis by night, proving that faith, like Rome itself, was never just one thing. Those orderly 12 months on your wall calendar might feel like an ancient Roman invention, but the truth is far messier and more political. Long before Julius Caesar imposed his famous Julian reforms, early Rome operated on a chaotic 10-month lunar calendar that barely matched the seasons. Farmers would have planted crops by dates that drifted further off track each year, with winter treated as a nameless gap between December and March. Imagine trying to schedule a festival when your January might fall in what we'd call autumn. That was Roman life before Caesar hired Egyptian astronomers to straighten things out. The original Roman calendar wasn't just shorter, it was steeped in myth and agricultural rhythms. March, named for the war god Mars, kicked off both the military campaign season and the new year. April likely came from the Latin aperia, meaning to open, as buds sprouted. But by December, 10th month in Latin, the system simply stopped. Winter was left unaccounted for, a time so insignificant to early Rome's agrarian society that it didn't merit months at all. King Numa Pompilius later tacked on January and February, but the lunar-based system still slipped out of sync with the solar year, requiring priests to intermittently insert an extra month called Mercedonius. These adjustments became so politicized that pontiffs would lengthen years to extend allies' terms or shorten enemies. Enter Caesar in 46 BC. Fresh from Egypt, where he'd marveled at their precise solar calendar, he ordered a sweeping reform. The Julian calendar introduced the 12-month structure we recognize, with 365 days and a leap year every 4. But here's the twist, even this rational system had imperial fingerprints all over it. Caesar shamelessly renamed Quintilis, the 5th month, to July in his own honor. His heir Augustus went further, stealing a day from February to make August equal in length to July, then demanding Sextilis be renamed for him too. These weren't neutral adjustments, they were power plays etched into time itself. What's often overlooked is how stubbornly old habits persisted. Farmers clung to lunar reckoning for generations, and some religious festivals kept their original seasonal timing, now detached from their agricultural roots. The kalends, nuns, and Ides, originally tied to moon phases, became arbitrary dates under the new system, though Shakespeare immortalized the Ides of March as Caesar's assassination deadline. Even the 7-day week, now universal, was a later import from the East. Early Romans used 8-day market cycles called nundini, the real surprise. Our modern Gregorian calendar, tweaked in 1582 to fix lingering Julian inaccuracies, still carries these ancient ego trips. July and August remain as monuments to men who reshaped time to crown their legacies, while September through December, once the 7th through 10th months, linger as linguistic fossils of a long-abandoned system. Next time you jot down a date, remember, those orderly squares on your calendar hide a history of celestial chaos, political meddling, and the sheer audacity of emperors who believed even the heavens should bow to their names. Walk into the ruins of a Roman villa, and you'll likely see the remains of a hypocaust, those raised floors supported by columns of bricks, with hot air from furnaces circulating beneath to warm the rooms above. It's easy to assume this was a uniquely Roman innovation, but here's the twist. They were brilliant adapters, not original inventors. Centuries before Rome's hypocausts heated aristocratic baths, the Greeks had already perfected a similar system called the glacis, channeling warm air beneath the floors of buildings like the 5th century BC Temple of Artemis at Ephesus. Even more striking, over in Korea, the Andol system, a network of flues beneath stone floors fueled by kitchen fires, was keeping homes toasty as early as the first millennium BC, long before Roman engineers laid their first brick pillar. What set Rome apart wasn't the concept, but the sheer scale and ambition. While Greek systems were often reserved for temples or elite homes, Roman engineers industrialized the technology, piping heat through entire bath complexes and sprawling villas. The hypocaust beneath the baths of Caracalla wasn't just functional. It was a masterpiece of logistics, with furnaces large enough to require teams of stokers and intricate networks of terracotta pipes regulating temperatures across different rooms. Senators could sweat in the coldarium, relax in the tepidarium, and cool off in the frigidarium, all thanks to a carefully calibrated underground highway of heat. Yet the real genius lay in their material choices. Roman builders lined hypocaust channels with hollow terracotta tubes called tubuli, which trapped heat more efficiently than stone. They even experimented with double-walled designs to maximize warmth, an ancient precursor to modern radiant heating. But for all their sophistication, these systems had limits. Hypocausts were wildly expensive to build and maintain, meaning only the wealthiest could enjoy them. The poet Seneca joked about the poor man shivering in his unheated apartment while his neighbor's hypocaust roasted the feet of slaves tasked with feeding the furnaces. The myth of Roman invention persists because they left such visible ruins. While Greek glacis systems crumbled or were repurposed, and Korean Andol evolved quietly in rural homes, Rome's hypocausts became symbols of imperial luxury. But the deeper truth is more fascinating. Rome's greatness lay in recognizing a good idea, refining it, and then stamping it across an empire. They didn't need to be first, they just had to be bold enough to turn clever engineering into an everyday marvel. Next time you admire those ancient brick pillars, remember, they're not just relics of innovation, but testaments to the power of scale, proving that sometimes the difference between obscurity and legacy isn't who invents something, but who dares to make it bigger. Rome's reputation as a nation of warriors forged by conquest and disciplined by the legion overlooks a surprising truth: many Romans wanted nothing to do with military service. While the empire's expansion was undeniably built on the backs of soldiers, the average citizen often went to great lengths to avoid the battlefield. During the Republic, wealthy families routinely paid substitutes to take their sons' places in the ranks, a practice so common that the poet Horace mocked it, joking that his own father bought him out of service to keep him writing poetry instead. Even the famed orator Cicero, whose speeches brim with patriotic fervor, openly praised peace as the ultimate civic virtue, arguing that war should only be waged so that we may live in quiet. Military culture wasn't a constant, it ebbed and flowed with Rome's ambitions. The early republic's farmer soldiers, who returned to their fields after each campaign, gave way to professional legions only after overseas conquests made year-round armies necessary. By the imperial era, frontier provinces like Gaul and Syria supplied most recruits, while Italian elites treated military postings as stepping stones to political careers rather than callings. Emperor Augustus had to offer cash bonuses just to fill the ranks, and later rulers relied increasingly on foreign mercenaries, proving that martial spirit wasn't as universal as the propaganda suggested. The myth of universal militarism stems from Rome's self-mythologizing. Victorious generals commissioned monuments like Trajan's Column, crammed with scenes of battle, while historians focused on wars because they made dramatic storytelling. But dig into everyday life, and you'll find evidence of deep ambivalence. Tombstones of commoners rarely highlight military service unless the deceased were career soldiers, and legal texts show citizens suing to avoid drafts. Even the satirist Juvenal quipped that the safest way to get rich in Rome was to inherit wealth, not loot it from conquered cities. What's most revealing is how military service became a class issue. While the poor saw the army as a path to citizenship and steady pay, the elite often viewed it as vulgar. Seneca advised young nobles to dabble in philosophy rather than waste years in camp. And by the late Empire, wealthy landowners bribed officials to exempt their sons from conscription altogether. The legions, once the backbone of Roman identity, gradually became a separate caste respected, but increasingly alien to the civilians they protected. This misconception matters because it flattens Rome's complexity into a stereotype. The empire wasn't built by a society of warriors, but by a pragmatic civilization that sometimes waged war brilliantly and often preferred to outsource the fighting. Next time you picture Rome, don't just imagine marching legions. Think of the draft dodgers, the philosophers extolling peace, and the bureaucrats who knew that true power lay as much in tax ledgers as in swords. Their greatest conquest wasn't on the battlefield, it was convincing the world they were always holding one. The image of ancient Romans bartering goats for sacks of grain couldn't be further from the truth. Their economy was a labyrinth of credit, investment, and speculative bubbles that would feel eerily familiar to modern bankers. While Hollywood loves showing chests of gold coins changing hands, archaeological evidence reveals a financial system shockingly advanced for its time. Take the Sulpicii, a banking family in Pompeii whose wax tablet records survived Vesuvius' eruption. Their ledgers detail everything from maritime insurance to complex loan agreements with interest rates meticulously calculated by the day. One contract even outlines a mortgage-style payment plan for a vineyard, complete with penalties for late installments. Romans didn't just have banks, they had financial instruments resembling modern corporations. The Societas Publicanorum were joint stock companies that bid on state contracts, from tax collection to temple construction. Investors could buy shares in these ventures, spreading risk much like today's mutual funds. Cicero once grumbled about senators losing fortunes speculating on Asian tax farming syndicates, proving that reckless investing isn't a Wall Street invention. Even small businesses operated on credit. A bakery in Herculaneum had its flour shipments financed through promissory notes signed with seals, not sacks of coins. Inflation crises expose another startling parallel. When emperors like Nero debased the silver denarius to fund lavish projects, the consequences were textbook economics. Prices soared, savings evaporated, and trust in currency collapsed. Diocletian's infamous edict on maximum prices in 301 AD, a desperate attempt to cap costs for everything from Egyptian linen to North African donkeys, reads like a failed government intervention straight out of an economics seminar. Workers' paychecks from this period show wages adjusted almost monthly to keep up with hyperinflation, a scenario that would give any modern central banker nightmares. The real surprise lies in how Romans tackled debt. Bankruptcy laws allowed insolvent debtors to negotiate repayment plans rather than face slavery, a surprisingly progressive approach for the era. Temples sometimes functioned as early credit unions, offering loans at lower rates than private lenders, and when financial panics hit, emperors occasionally declared debt amnesties, an ancient precursor to modern stimulus packages. The poet Juvenal sarcastically praised one such cancellation, noting how it turned bankrupt nobles into instant millionaires overnight at creditors' expense. What makes this misconception so persistent is the lack of physical evidence. Unlike temples or aqueducts, financial transactions left few ruins, just faint traces in crumbling papyri or legal codes. But the echoes are unmistakable. Lawsuits over fraudulent bonds, merchants hedging against currency fluctuations, even speculative real estate bubbles in cities like Ostia. Next time you swipe a credit card or fret over stock markets, remember, you're participating in a system the Romans would recognize. Their economy wasn't primitive, it was proto-modern, proving that money, in all its messy complexity, has always been more about trust than treasure. The glittering villas of Rome's elite and the empire's legendary conquests might paint a picture of endless prosperity, but scratch beneath the gilded surface, and you'd find an economy riddled with wild inequalities and instability. For every senator lounging on a couch inlaid with gemstones, there were thousands of plebeians lining up for the daily grain dole, their survival tethered to the state's fickle generosity. This wasn't just a gap between rich and poor, it was a chasm wide enough to swallow entire social classes. Take the infamous Crassus, Rome's wealthiest man, who allegedly said no one should be considered rich unless they could raise a private army, while the average laborer earned barely enough to buy a pair of sandals after a month's work. Economic booms and busts were as predictable as the Tiber flooding. When conquests brought in shiploads of Egyptian grain or Spanish silver, markets buzzed with activity. But let one bad harvest hit or a pirate raid disrupt trade routes, and prices could spiral overnight. Emperor Augustus tried to stabilize the chaos by creating the Aerarium Militare, a military treasury funded by sales taxes, but even that couldn't prevent crises like the Great Inflation under Nero. As emperors debased coins to pay for wars and spectacles, the denarius went from nearly pure silver to a copper core with a thin silver wash, leaving merchants squinting at scales to weigh their now suspect currency. The grain dole, often romanticized as a benevolent welfare system, was really a political time bomb. By the 1st century BC, nearly a third of Rome's population relied on free or subsidized grain, creating a volatile dependency. When Clodius Pulcher made the dole entirely free in 58 BC, the treasury groaned under the cost, and later emperors like Septimius Severus had to add free olive oil and pork to prevent riots. Meanwhile, in the countryside, small farmers, once the backbone of the Republic, were squeezed off their land by wealthy elites who consolidated estates worked by slave labor. Tibullus, a poet from a once prosperous farming family, wrote bitterly of returning to find his ancestral fields swallowed by a neighbor's villa. Archaeology reveals the stark contrasts. Excavations in Pompeii show opulent townhouses with mosaic floors and piped water, just blocks away from cramped Insulae apartments where families huddled in single rooms, their walls scorched by cheap oil lamps. A single feast at Trimalchio's table could cost more than a carpenter earned in a year, and Seneca noted the absurdity of elites drinking wine chilled with snow hauled from mountaintops while the poor queued for rancid grain. The satirist Juvenal captured the mood perfectly. The average Roman, he wrote, cared only for bread and circuses, just enough food and entertainment to keep them from rebellion. What makes this misconception so persistent is the sheer visibility of Roman wealth. The monuments that survived the Pantheon, the Coliseum, were funded by emperors flaunting their power, not by a broadly prosperous society. But the real story lies in the cracks between those marble slabs, the wax tablets recording desperate loans, the skeletons in mass graves showing signs of malnutrition, and the graffiti scrawled by ordinary Romans mocking the elites who feasted on peacock brains while we ate dirt. Rome's economy wasn't a rising tide that lifted all boats, it was a storm that drowned the many to float the few. Next time you admire a golden aureus in a museum case, remember, for every coin stamped with an emperor's face, there were countless hands that never held one. Those pristine white marble temples gleaming under the Mediterranean sun, a complete accident of time, one that would have baffled ancient Romans who knew their buildings as riotous explosions of color. Walk through the Roman Forum in its heyday, and you'd have squinted against vibrant reds, cobalt blues, and gilded accents covering every surface. The Pantheon's porch wasn't a stoic gray. Its columns were likely painted to mimic expensive pink granite, while the frieze above shimmered with gold leaf. Even Trajan's Column, that towering monument to military precision, was originally a kaleidoscope of painted shields and tunics, its intricate carvings highlighted with pigments so vivid you could have traced the battle scenes from 100 feet away. The myth of monochrome majesty took root thanks to Renaissance artists and neoclassical architects who mistook weather-worn ruins for intentional design. Michelangelo and his peers studied exposed marble skeletons, not realizing rain and centuries had scrubbed away the original hues. By the time 18th century, Europe fell in love with classical aesthetics. White had become synonymous with purity and grandeur, a misconception cemented by museum displays that showcased bare statues as the ideal. But science now tells a different story. Ultraviolet light and microscopic pigment analysis reveal traces of vermilion, Egyptian blue, and malachite green clinging to crevices in temple pediments. In Pompeii's Villa of the Mysteries, entire walls still blaze with frescoes so intact they look freshly painted. Romans didn't just dabble in color, they engineered it. Wealthy patrons imported rare pigments from across the empire: crimson from crushed Spanish insects, deep purple from murex snails, blinding white lead from Greek mines. The famed Pompeian red wasn't a single shade but a spectrum ranging from burnt orange to rosy pink, mixed with such skill that modern restorers struggle to replicate it. Temples dedicated to Jupiter might feature his statue with ivory skin and robes of Tyrian purple, while Venus's shrine dazzled with mother-of-pearl inlays mimicking her mythical birth from sea foam. What's truly fascinating is how these choices reflected Roman values. Color wasn't mere decoration, it conveyed meaning. Triumphal arches used red to symbolize military victory, while blue-green hues in bathhouses evoked healing waters. Statues of emperors had lifelike flesh tones and glass eyes, meant to inspire awe, not the cold detachment we associate with marble today. Even humble apartment blocks wore bright stucco facades, their geometric patterns guiding pedestrians through crowded streets like a neon-lit modern boulevard. The real tragedy, this vibrant legacy was nearly lost to time. Medieval lime burners recycled marble statues into mortar, deliberately destroying pagan colors. Acid rain dissolved fragile pigments from exposed monuments, but thanks to digital reconstructions and painstaking archaeology, we're finally seeing Rome as it was, not a silent, monochrome museum, but a living city that loved color as fiercely as we do. Next time you admire a Roman ruin, picture it not as a ghost of white stone, but as a fireworks display frozen in time, proof that the ancient world was anything but pale. The idea that Rome's influence stopped at the edges of Europe is like saying the internet only exists in Silicon Valley. It completely misses the vast, interconnected web they helped spin across continents. While legions planted eagles from Britain to Syria, Roman merchants and explorers were venturing far beyond, weaving trade networks that stretched to places most citizens only knew from exotic legends. Take the bustling port of Berenice on Egypt's Red Sea coast, where archaeologists have unearthed everything from Indian black pepper to Chinese silk buried in Roman-era trash heaps. These weren't rare luxuries, they were bulk commodities, proof that trade with the East wasn't just occasional, it was an economic lifeline. One of the most striking testaments to Rome's global reach is the Periplus of the Erythraean Sea, a first-century merchant's guidebook detailing voyages to India and East Africa. It reads like an ancient trip advisor, listing which ports offered the best prices for tortoiseshell or where to avoid pirate infestations. Roman ships, built with Indian teak and outfitted with monsoon season navigation techniques borrowed from Arab sailors, could reach India's Malabar coast in under 40 days, a journey so routine that customs posts in Alexandria taxed incoming spices at set rates. Tamil poets in southern India even wrote of Yavanas, their term for Romans bartering gold for pearls, their harsh voices haggling in marketplaces under the tropical sun. China, though more distant, was no stranger to Roman goods. Han Dynasty records describe Dakin, their name for Rome sending envoys, or more likely, ambitious merchants posing as diplomats bearing gifts of glassware and gold embroidery. The fascination went both ways. Roman geographer Ptolemy mapped the Silk Road with surprising accuracy, while wealthy patricians draped themselves in Chinese silk so sheer that Seneca complained it left nothing to the imagination. The demand was insatiable. Emperor Tiberius once griped about Rome's gold draining eastward to pay for these luxuries, a trade imbalance that foreshadowed modern economic anxieties. But the real surprise lies in Africa. Roman expeditions pushed south along the Nile and beyond, reaching Meroe in modern Sudan and possibly as far as Ethiopia's highlands. A fresco in Pompeii depicts a distinctly African rhinoceros, likely brought back through these networks, while potsherds inscribed with Tamil and Greek found in Tanzania suggest trade links stretching down the Swahili coast. Even sub-Saharan gold reached Rome, filtered through middlemen like the Garamantes of Libya, who built underground tunnels to mine Saharan deposits. The myth of an inward-looking Rome persists because its European ruins are so visible, while the fragile traces of distant trade, a scrap of silk in a London grave, a Roman coin in a Vietnamese field, require detective work to piece together. But these connections weren't marginal. They shaped Rome's economy and culture. When Pliny the Elder grumbled about Rome's addiction to Eastern luxuries, he wasn't describing a niche market. He was witnessing globalization in its infancy. The next time you picture Rome, don't just see togas and aqueducts. Imagine docks stacked with cinnamon from Sri Lanka, warehouses smelling of Arabian frankincense, and a world far more vast than the maps in your textbook ever suggested. The Praetorian Guard might look like elite protectors in Hollywood films, stern, disciplined soldiers standing shoulder to defend their emperor. But history paints a far messier picture. These weren't just bodyguards, they were kingmakers, assassins, and occasionally the most dangerous mercenaries in Rome. The infamous incident in 1930 AD, when they murdered Emperor Pertinax and literally auctioned the throne to the highest bidder, wasn't an outlier. It was the culmination of a century of calculated betrayals. The Guards' loyalty wasn't to the empire or even to the office of emperor. It was to whoever lined their pockets fastest. Their corruption started early. Augustus created the Praetorians as a personal security force, but by the reign of Tiberius, they were already flexing political muscle. When the ambitious Sejanus became their prefect, he turned them into a shadow government, manipulating Tiberius from his island exile. Later, when Caligula was assassinated, it was the Praetorians who stumbled upon his uncle Claudius hiding behind a palace curtain and promptly declared him emperor, recognizing a pliable figurehead when they saw one. Their logic was chillingly pragmatic. Why serve an unpredictable ruler when you could install one who owed you everything? The Guards' power came from their unique position. Stationed in Rome itself, unlike the frontier legions, they controlled the capital's fate. Emperors knew this Domitian increased their pay to buy loyalty, while Marcus Aurelius kept them in check by leading military campaigns personally, earning their respect through shared hardship. But when weak rulers like Commodus indulged them with extravagant bonuses, the message was clear: loyalty had a price tag. By the 3rd century, the Praetorians weren't just influencing succession. They were dictating it, deposing and installing emperors like chess pieces. The real irony: the very reforms meant to tame them only made things worse. Septimius Severus, after overthrowing their chosen emperor Didius Julianus, the winner of that shameful auction, disbanded the corrupt guard, only to refill its ranks with his own loyal legionaries. The result: a new generation of Praetorians who learned that emperors were replaceable. Their final act of betrayal came in 312 AD, when they backed Maxentius against Constantine at the Milvian Bridge. Constantine's victory marked their end. He abolished them permanently, replacing them with a smaller, less politicized force. The Praetorian myth persists because it's comforting to imagine protectors as incorruptible. But their true legacy is a warning about power unchecked. They weren't rogue actors, they were products of a system that treated the throne as a prize to be won. Next time you see them standing stoically in a film, remember, history's most feared bodyguards didn't just defend emperors, they devoured them. Rome's legal system is often held up as a cornerstone of Western justice, but if you were poor, indebted, or simply on the wrong side of a patrician's grudge, those vaunted laws could feel more like a trap than protection. Take the infamous 12 Tables, Rome's earliest legal code carved into bronze around 450 BC. While they included progressive ideas like the right to face accusers, they also enshrined brutal practices like debt bondage, where defaulters could be seized and forced into slavery, sometimes even dismembered if they couldn't pay. The law coldly stated that creditors could cut pieces off a debtor's body with no limit beyond, taking no more than 1 pound of flesh. Sound familiar? Shakespeare borrowed that very concept for The Merchant of Venice, proving how long these injustices haunted the cultural memory. Wealth didn't just influence outcomes, it shaped the system's very structure. Patricians controlled the courts, and without money for skilled advocates like Cicero, a plebeian's chances were slim. The poet Juvenal mocked this imbalance, writing that a poor man's testimony was worthless unless backed by a sack of coins. Even when reforms slowly chipped away at the worst abuses, like the Lex Poetilia in 326 BC, which abolished debt slavery, loopholes remained. Landlords could still seize property or force debtors into indentured labor, a distinction without much difference for those crushed under the weight of loans. The legal theater was just as skewed. High-profile trials often became political spectacles where eloquence outweighed evidence. When Clodius was accused of sacrilege for infiltrating a women's religious festival, his defense hinged not on facts but on bribing jurors and smearing witnesses. Cicero's victory in the case was less about justice and more about his ability to outmaneuver opponents with theatrics, like staging a dramatic reveal of a forged document mid-trial. For every noble like Seneca, who argued that true law should be the bond of civil society, there were a dozen real-world cases where verdicts went to the highest bidder. Yet change did come glacially through stubborn advocacy. The Gracchi brothers pushed for agrarian laws to redistribute land from the elite, though their efforts cost them their lives. Centuries later, Emperor Justinian's codification of Roman law softened some edges, prohibiting torture for free citizens and standardizing penalties. But the system's core paradox endured. Laws designed to uphold order often reinforced inequality. The real legacy of Roman justice isn't its fairness, but its durability, a proof that even flawed systems can outlast empires, carrying their contradictions forward like shadows. The idea that Romans cared more about swords than scrolls couldn't be further from the truth. Education was a status symbol, a political weapon, and sometimes even a path to freedom. While Hollywood loves to paint Rome as a place where brute strength trumped book smarts, graffiti scrawled on Pompeii's walls, from shopkeepers' receipts to love poems, proves literacy wasn't just for elites. Even enslaved tutors like Epictetus, who later gained fame as a philosopher, were prized for their knowledge, showing how deeply Romans respected learning if you could pay for it. Schools in Rome operated on a tiered system that would feel eerily familiar today. Young children from wealthy families started with the ludi magister, a primary teacher who drilled them in reading, writing, and arithmetic using wax tablets and abacuses. The next level, the grammaticus, introduced literature. Students passed Virgil's Aeneid line by line, analyzing its grammar like modern kids dissect Shakespeare. But the pinnacle was rhetoric school, where teenage boys and occasionally girls from progressive families learned to argue like Cicero. These weren't dusty lectures. Students debated current events, practiced courtroom speeches, and even held mock Senate sessions. A well-delivered argument could make a young noble's career, or, as Seneca warned, a sloppy one could ruin it. The real surprise, Rome's education system had more social mobility than you'd expect. Freedmen who'd been educated as slaves often opened their own schools, catering to merchant-class families hungry for advancement. Emperor Vespasian, though mocked for his provincial accent, famously subsidized Greek and Latin professorships, creating an early version of public university chairs. And while girls were usually taught at home, exceptions like Hypatia, the Neoplatonist philosopher who lectured to packed classrooms in Alexandria, proved intellect wasn't gendered. Even the military recognized education's value. Centurions kept records in meticulous Latin, while engineers calculated aqueduct slopes using geometry treatises. Yet for all its sophistication, Roman education had glaring gaps. The poor relied on informal apprenticeships if they learned at all, and rural children might only master enough math to count sheep. The satirist Juvenal joked that a typical plebeian's library was just a single dog-eared scroll, and while Rome's literacy rate, estimated at 15–30%, dwarfed medieval Europe's, it paled next to classical Athens near universal male schooling. Knowledge was power, but like so much in Rome, it was power for sale. The myth of anti-intellectualism likely stems from later Christian writers painting pagan Rome as decadent. But dig deeper, and you'll find a society obsessed with ideas, where senators quoted Greek poetry in debates, architects studied Euclid, and even gladiators' epitaphs boasted of their philosophical tastes. The real divide wasn't between learned and ignorant, but between those who could afford wisdom and those who bartered for scraps. Next time you picture a Roman, don't just see a soldier or a senator. Imagine a student hunched over a wax tablet, etching words that might outlast empires. The idea that all Romans suffered from terrible diets soaked in lead and devoid of nutrition misses the vibrant reality of their culinary world. Yes, lead poisoning was a risk, especially for the wealthy, sipping wine sweetened with syrup boiled in lead pots, and vitamin deficiencies could creep in during long winters. But to paint the entire empire with that broad brush ignores the incredible diversity of what landed on Roman tables, from the bustling port cities to remote military outposts. Take the foundation of their diet, bread and olive oil. Archaeologists studying Roman latrine waste have found evidence of whole-grain loaves packed with fiber, often enriched with legumes like lentils or chickpeas. Olive oil wasn't just a cooking staple, it was a nutritional powerhouse, drizzled over vegetables, fish, and even bread as a cheap source of healthy fats. The poet Horace bragged about his simple meals of olives, endives, and mallows, a salad that wouldn't look out of place in a modern farm-to-table restaurant. Soldiers stationed along Hadrian's Wall received rations of whole wheat biscuits, salted pork, and hard cheese, basic but balanced, designed to sustain men marching 20 miles a day. Fish sauce, or garum, gets a bad rap today for its pungent smell, but it was the Roman equivalent of soy sauce, a fermented condiment packed with umami flavor and, surprisingly, protein. Excavations from Spain to Britain reveal small-scale garum workshops, suggesting even modest households had access to this flavor booster. And while lead pipes did exist, many communities relied on terracotta aqueducts or simply drank watered-down wine, a practice that not only reduced alcohol content but also minimized microbial risks, since the alcohol acted as a mild antiseptic. Seasonal eating wasn't a trendy choice, it was a necessity. Fresh fruits like figs, pears, and apples appeared in markets across the empire, while preserved foods like pickled vegetables and dried fish bridged the gaps during leaner months. Military medical manuals stressed the importance of fresh greens to prevent scurvy on campaign, and archaeologists have found evidence of Roman soldiers growing cabbage near frontier forts. Even the notorious vomitoriums weren't binge-eating venues as often claimed. They were simply passageways in amphitheaters, a linguistic mix-up that fueled the myth of Romans gorging and purging. The real dietary divide wasn't between healthy and unhealthy, but between rich and poor. Emperors might suffer from gout after feasting on stuffed dormice, while laborers thrived on humble pulses and coarse bread. A tombstone in Gaul commemorates a freedman who proudly listed maker of fine sausages as his profession, and carbonized remains from Pompeii's streets reveal snack bars selling hot stews and flatbreads to busy workers. The lesson here isn't that Rome had perfect nutrition, no ancient society did, but that their diet was as varied and adaptable as their empire, proving that even 2,000 years ago, food wasn't just survival. It was culture, identity, and sometimes pure joy. Rome's rigid class system might seem like an impenetrable fortress of privilege, but the cracks in that facade allowed astonishing stories of social climbing that would make even the most ambitious modern influencer blush. Take the freedman Gaius Caecilius Isidorus, who went from enslaved laborer to one of Italy's wealthiest landowners in the 1st century BC, leaving a will that boasted of owning over 4,000 slaves himself. Or consider the Emperor Pertinax, born the son of a freedman and a charcoal merchant, who rose through the military ranks to briefly wear the purple in 193 AD. These weren't freak exceptions, they were proof that Roman society had backdoors for talent, grit, and sometimes just sheer luck. The path from slavery to prosperity was shockingly well trodden. Freedmen, former slaves granted liberty, often retained close ties to their ex-masters, leveraging those connections into business ventures. The House of the Vetii in Pompeii stands as a marble-clad monument to this mobility. Once enslaved brothers Aulus Vettius Conviva and Aulus Vettius Restitutus built a fortune in the wine trade, then flaunted it with a villa stuffed with frescoes of mythological scenes their former owners would have recognized from elite education. Their story wasn't unique. Inscriptions across the empire record freedmen as bankers, shipbuilders, even architects like the Greek-born Cyrus, who designed buildings for Emperor Augustus despite starting life in chains. Even the political ladder had rungs for outsiders. The equestrian class Rome's middle management tier regularly absorbed wealthy freedmen's descendants, while the army served as a great equalizer. Thracian-born Maximinus Thrax went from shepherd to emperor in the 3rd century, his rough manners mocked by senators but his military prowess undeniable. Women, though barred from formal office, exercised influence through marriage alliances and patronage. The Empress Theodora, wife of Justinian, began life as an actress, a profession so disreputable it was legally akin to prostitution, yet ended up co-ruling the Byzantine Empire, passing laws to protect actresses from exploitation. The engine behind this mobility, cold, hard cash. Roman society worshipped wealth as fervently as any god. A freedman who amassed enough money could buy respectability through lavish public donations funding temples, baths, or gladiator games to scrub away the stigma of servitude. The baker Eurysaces built himself a tomb shaped like grain silos near Rome's Porta Maggiore, its friezes depicting bread-making machinery as a middle finger to elites who sneered at his profession. Meanwhile, the legal system actively facilitated integration. Freedmen's children were born full citizens, their pasts fading faster than a senator's wine stain. But let's not romanticize this wasn't some ancient meritocracy. Glass ceilings shattered more easily for some than others. Greek-speaking freedmen from educated backgrounds fared better than those from barbarian regions, and skin color could still draw prejudice, as the poet Martial's snide remarks about blue-black Ethiopians reveal. The satirist Juvenal grumbled about wealthy freedmen elbowing aside impoverished nobles at dinner parties, proving that old money still resented new. And for every success story, thousands of ex-slaves died in obscurity, their freedom papers not worth the wax they were stamped on. What makes Rome's social fluidity so fascinating isn't that it was fair, but that it was possible at all. In a world where most ancient societies treated status as fixed at birth, Rome's chaotic, greedy energy created loopholes for talent to slip through. The lesson here isn't about equality, it's about opportunity, and how even the most hierarchical systems can't completely stifle the human hunger to rise. Next time you walk through ruins adorned with freedmen's names, remember, those weren't just signatures, they were declarations that in Rome, sometimes the underdog got to howl at the moon. That pristine image of Roman art, all white marble statues and perfectly proportioned busts, ignores the wild, vibrant chaos that actually filled the empire's galleries and streets. Sure, they inherited Greece's obsession with idealized forms, but Roman artists were just as likely to shatter those rules as follow them. Take the Fayum mummy portraits from Egypt, hauntingly realistic faces painted in wax and pigment, their eyes following you across centuries. These weren't airbrushed gods, but middle-class merchants and grandmothers, their wrinkles and crooked noses preserved with unflinching honesty. Meanwhile, in Britain, Celtic craftsmen were twisting Roman motifs into swirling abstract mosaics, like the 4th century Hinton St. Mary floor, where Christ's face appears amidst pagan vine scrolls, a cultural remix no classical purist would have imagined. Provincial artists didn't just copy Rome, they talked back to it. In Syria, Pomeran sculptors carved funerary busts with exaggerated, almost cartoonish eyes, a local trademark that turned deceased wool merchants into wide-eyed icons. Over in Gaul, potters slapped cheerful, crude graffiti onto their wares, like a jar from Lyon boasting, "Lucius's wine is the best," alongside a lopsided dolphin. Even Rome's official art had split personalities. Augustus famously pushed a classical revival to legitimize his rule, but his own wife Livia decorated her villa with fantastical garden frescoes where songbirds perched on impossible pink trees. The message: there was no single Roman style, just 1,000 conversations between tradition and rebellion. The real giveaway lies in their portraiture. Compare the stoic, ageless face of Augustus's prima porta statue to the grizzled visage of Emperor Vespasian, his brow furrowed like a retired soldier who'd seen too much. One was propaganda, the other brutal honesty. Or consider the domestic art Pompeii's middle class loved lewd tavern paintings of gamblers squabbling, or delicate glass bowls flashed with gold leaf for dinner parties. This wasn't art meant for temples. It was art for living, breathing people who wanted beauty, humor, and sometimes a good scandal on their walls. Perhaps the most striking evidence comes from the empire's edges. In Roman Britain, a silver skillet was engraved with a mix of Latin blessings and Celtic knotwork, the owner's way of saying, "I'll take both, thanks." And in Dura Europos on the Euphrates, a synagogue's walls blazed with biblical scenes painted in vibrant Persian colors, proving that Roman art could wear a dozen cultural costumes. The empire didn't homogenize creativity. It gave local voices new stages. So next time you see a textbook reduce Roman art to neat columns and copies of Greek masterpieces, remember the mosaic workshop in Antioch where an artisan sneaked a portrait of his grumpy cat into the corner of a geometric design. The real legacy isn't perfection, it's the glorious, messy collision of 100 artistic dialects, all shouting their truths in pigment, stone, and gold. The notion that Romans blundered blindly through disease-ridden streets, oblivious to basic sanitation, crumbles under the weight of evidence. While they certainly didn't grasp the concept of microbes, their public health strategies reveal a society making shockingly accurate guesses about disease transmission. Take the Cloaca Maxima, Rome's monumental sewer system completed as early as the 6th century BC. This wasn't just about civic pride. Ancient sources like Pliny the Elder explicitly linked stagnant water and foul odors to outbreaks of pestilence. Engineers designed the sewers to whisk waste away from populated areas, and laws prohibited dumping corpses in the Tiber, showing a clear, if imperfect, understanding of environmental contamination. Hospitals further proved their pragmatic approach. Legionary forts like Vindolanda along Hadrian's Wall featured valetudinaria military hospitals with separate wards for infectious patients, surgical tools sterilized in boiling water even if they didn't know why it worked, and drainage systems to keep floors dry. The physician Galen, though misguided about imbalanced humors, insisted wounds be cleaned with vinegar and wine, substances we now know have antiseptic properties. Even their famed aqueducts included sedimentation tanks to filter debris, and Frontinus, Rome's water commissioner, boasted about shutting off contaminated lines during epidemics. Quarantine wasn't a medieval invention. Romans practiced it ruthlessly. When plague struck, officials isolated the sick in makeshift camps outside city walls, a tactic described by historian Livy during outbreaks in the Republican era. Wealthy households kept fever rooms for ailing slaves to prevent spreading illness to the workforce. The 12 Tables, Rome's earliest law code, mandated burying the dead far from water sources, while agricultural writers like Cotto recommended burning the tools and clothes of those who died from contagion. The real genius lay in their infrastructure's scalability, from Pompeii's street-side fountains providing clean water to the poor, to Ostia's public latrines with constantly flushed stone seats. These weren't luxuries but calculated health interventions. The irony, their very success bred vulnerability. Dense urban populations and empire-wide trade networks created ideal conditions for pandemics like the Antonine Plague, which killed millions in the 2nd century AD. Yet even then, their response, burning infected goods, restricting travel, showed a society fighting contagion with the best tools it had. What makes this misconception so persistent is our tendency to judge history by modern standards. Yes, Romans believed in bad air miasma theory and divine wrath as disease causes, but their actions often aligned with what germ theory would later confirm: isolate the sick, purify water, remove waste. The lesson here isn't about their ignorance, it's about how observation and trial and error could achieve remarkable sophistication, even without microscopes. Next time you flush a toilet or wash your hands, remember, you're participating in a tradition of public health that Romans helped pioneer, one pragmatic decision at a time. The Roman Republic didn't collapse because people suddenly forgot their morals. It fractured under the weight of systemic pressures that had been building for generations. Sure, you'll find plenty of ancient writers like Sallust waxing poetic about how luxury corrupted Rome's virtuous soul, but that's more nostalgic finger wagging than actual analysis. The real cracks in the Republic's foundation were economic, military, and political forces so intertwined that pulling one thread unraveled the whole system. Start with wealth inequality. Rome's conquests flooded the elite with riches, while small farmers, the backbone of the early Republic, lost their lands to debt and foreclosure. These weren't lazy peasants. They were veterans who'd spent years fighting abroad, only to return home and find their fields auctioned off to wealthy senators expanding their estates. Tiberius Gracchus saw this crisis brewing when he pushed for land reform in 133 BC, arguing that a republic couldn't survive when its citizens had no stake in the land. His reward, a clubbing to death by senators who saw redistribution as theft. The message was clear: the elite would rather burn the republic than share its spoils. Meanwhile, the military's loyalty was shifting from the state to warlords who promised plunder and pensions. General Marius's reforms in 107 BC allowed landless men to enlist, creating a professional army that owed its allegiance to commanders, not the Senate. When Sulla marched on Rome with his legions in 88 BC, it wasn't for ideological purity. It was because his soldiers knew he'd reward them with confiscated estates. This trend reached its peak with Julius Caesar, whose troops followed him across the Rubicon not for love of republicanism, but because he'd made them rich. The Republic's fatal flaw: it couldn't decide whether soldiers were citizen defenders or mercenaries. Political gridlock sealed the deal. The Senate, designed for a city-state, couldn't manage an empire. Reforms stalled as factions vetoed each other out of spite, while provincial governors like Vers looted entire regions with impunity. Cicero's speeches against corruption read like a broken record, full of fiery rhetoric but powerless to stop the rot. Even elections became battlegrounds. Clodius and Milo didn't campaign with policy platforms, they hired street gangs to intimidate voters. By the time Augustus staged his restoration of the Republic, the institutions were hollow shells, their rituals preserved like a painted corpse. The moral decay narrative persists because it's simple, but history is rarely about good people turning bad. It's about systems buckling under their own contradictions. Rome didn't fall because its citizens stopped believing in virtue. It fell because too few had too much, too many had too little, and the army realized it held all the swords. The real tragedy: many of those who mourned the Republic's death had spent their lives strangling its future. The blood-soaked tales of emperors like Caligula and Nero might dominate the headlines, but the reality is far less dramatic. Many Roman emperors actually died in their beds, surrounded by their families, after long and stable reigns. Take Vespasian, the no-nonsense general who ruled for nearly a decade and famously joked on his deathbed, "Dear me, I think I'm becoming a god." His reign was a masterclass in pragmatism, rebuilding Rome's finances after Nero's excesses, completing the Coliseum, and even taxing public urinals when his son Titus objected. He reportedly held a coin to his nose and asked, "Does it smell?" Far from a chaotic end, Vespasian succumbed to a fever at age 69, passing the throne peacefully to his son, a rarity in imperial history. Then there's Antoninus Pius, whose 23-year reign was so uneventful that historians struggle to fill pages about it. No purges, no civil wars, just efficient administration and public works. He died of natural causes at 74, leaving the empire in such good shape that his successor Marcus Aurelius called his rule a golden age. Even Augustus, Rome's first emperor, ruled for over 40 years before dying quietly in his villa at 75, surrounded by loved ones. His last words, "Have I played my part well?" suggest a man reflecting on legacy, not fearing assassins. The violent emperor myth persists because chaos sells. Chroniclers like Suetonius and Tacitus fixated on scandals, Commodus fighting gladiators, Domitian's paranoid purges, while stable rulers made for dull reading. But the numbers don't lie. Of Rome's 80-plus emperors, at least a third died of illness or old age. Some, like Hadrian, spent their final years dictating memoirs and designing their own mausoleums. His still stands as Castel Sant'Angelo. Others, like Claudius, often portrayed as a bumbling fool, actually expanded the empire and died suddenly, possibly from food poisoning, rather than the poisoned mushrooms of legend. The real surprise: many bad emperors lived long lives. Nero ruled for 14 years before his suicide, while Elagabalus survived 4 chaotic years before his own guards turned on him. Compare that to the good Emperor Titus, who died of plague after just 2 years. Stability, not virtue, dictated longevity. The lesson here isn't that Rome lacked brutality, it's that power wasn't always a death sentence. Behind the headline-grabbing coups were decades of competent governance, proving that sometimes the most revolutionary thing an emperor could do was simply retire for the night. Romans get branded as copycats who merely stole Greek ideas and slapped arches on them. But that stereotype ignores their genius for taking existing concepts and supercharging them into world-changing innovations. Take the humble arch. While the Etruscans and others used it occasionally, Roman engineers scaled it up into engineering marvels like the Pont du Gard aqueduct, stacking 3 tiers of arches 160 feet high to deliver water across 30 miles of rugged French terrain. This wasn't just improvement, it was reinvention. They didn't stop at functionality, they turned arches into propaganda, sculpting the Arch of Titus and Constantine as stone billboards celebrating military victories. Concrete tells an even wilder story. The Pantheon's dome, still the world's largest unreinforced concrete structure after 2 millennia, wasn't just big, it was smart. Engineers mixed lightweight pumice into the upper layers to reduce stress, while the oculus at the top acted as a natural compression ring. Vitruvius, Rome's superstar architect, didn't just document these techniques, he pushed boundaries, advocating for materials science experiments like adding volcanic ash to mortar for underwater construction. His writings reveal a culture obsessed with problem-solving, not just preserving tradition. Yet here's the fascinating tension. Romans were paradoxically conservative about social innovation. The same society that built sewage systems fit for modern cities clung to agrarian nostalgia, with senators like Cotto the Elder waxing poetic about turnip farming, while their wealth came from sprawling industrial olive presses. Emperor Augustus famously dressed in homespun wool to project old-school values, even as his builders revolutionized urban planning with fireproof concrete apartment blocks. The myth of technophobic Romans likely stems from their own propaganda. Elite writers like Pliny the Elder praised ancient ways, while quietly benefiting from aqueducts and heated floors. But archaeology doesn't lie. From adjustable bronze surgical tools to the Antikythera mechanisms, gears, a Greek invention the Romans likely refined. Their willingness to tinker was undeniable. Even their conservative agriculture saw innovations like mechanical reapers in Gaul and screw-powered olive presses doubling oil production, the real lesson. Rome's brilliance lay in balancing reverence for the past with ruthless pragmatism. They'd toast ancestors with ceremonial clay cups, while drinking from lead crystal glassware imported from Alexandria. Their legacy isn't just arches or aqueducts, it's proving that cultural pride and cutting-edge progress aren't opposites, but partners in building something that lasts. Rome's fall wasn't the catastrophic end of civilization Hollywood loves to depict. It was more like a relay race where the baton passed seamlessly to Constantinople, where Roman law, art, and Greek philosophy didn't just survive, they thrived under a new name, Byzantium. While the Western Empire crumbled under barbarian invasions and bureaucratic decay, the eastern half, with its capital on the Bosporus, carried forward Rome's legacy for another 1,000 years. Justinian's codification of Roman law in the 6th century wasn't some nostalgic throwback. It was a living, breathing legal system that would shape European jurisprudence for centuries. His architects built the Hagia Sophia, a dome so audacious it defied physics, while scholars preserved Plato and Aristotle in libraries that would later ignite the Renaissance. The so-called Dark Ages were anything but dark in the East. They were a golden age of mosaics, silk diplomacy, and theological debates that kept the flame of antiquity burning. Meanwhile, the myth of a post-Rome intellectual wasteland ignores the dazzling advancements happening beyond Europe's borders. While the West fractured into petty kingdoms, Baghdad's House of Wisdom became the world's premier research center, where Muslim scholars translated Greek texts into Arabic, advancing medicine, astronomy, and mathematics. Thinkers like Al-Khwarizmi didn't just preserve Euclid, they invented algebra and refined the decimal system. In Cordoba, Islamic Spain's libraries held 500,000 volumes at a time when the largest monastery collection in Christendom might scrape together a few hundred. Even Charlemagne, the Frankish king often credited with reviving learning, imported scholars from Byzantium and the Islamic world because he knew where the real knowledge lived. The term Dark Ages says more about 19th century historians than it does about actual history. While Rome's western roads fell into disrepair, Constantinople's streets remained lit with oil lamps, its hospitals offered free care, and its merchants traded as far as China. The Bulgar ruler Simon, after besieging the city in the 10th century, didn't sack it. He demanded his sons be educated in Byzantine schools. Over in Aachen, Charlemagne's scribes were still struggling to spell Latin correctly, while Byzantine bureaucrats wrote in a refined Attic Greek that would have made Cicero jealous. The real tragedy isn't that Rome fell, it's that we've pretended its legacy died with it, erasing the vibrant civilizations that kept its wisdom alive. Byzantium's endurance forces us to rethink what collapse even means. When Ottoman cannons finally breached Constantinople's walls in 1453, refugees didn't flee into a cultural void. They carried precious manuscripts to Italy, where scholars like Bessarion jump-started the humanist movement. The last Byzantine emperor died fighting, but his niece Sophia Palaeologina married Russia's Ivan Roman III, transplanting Roman imperial symbolism to Moscow, where czars would claim to be the Third Rome. The threads of antiquity didn't snap, they unraveled slowly, weaving themselves into new tapestries from Florence to Samarkand. So next time you hear about Rome's fall, remember, civilizations don't end, they evolve, often in ways too subtle for textbooks to capture but too profound for history to forget. The idea that we've uncovered all there is to know about Rome couldn't be further from the truth. Every year, archaeologists and historians peel back another layer of the empire's story, often upending what we thought we knew. Take the recent breakthroughs in Pompeii, where advanced imaging technology is cracking open carbonized scrolls from the Villa of the Papyri, a library frozen in time by Vesuvius eruption. These texts, once considered unreadable ash, are now revealing lost works of philosophy, poetry, and even early scientific treatises thanks to AI-powered X-ray tomography. One partially decoded scroll from 2023 contained previously unknown musings from the Epicurean philosopher Philodemus, proving that entire schools of thought might still be waiting in the ashes. But it's not just high-tech tools rewriting history. Simple digs still yield seismic discoveries. In 2021, workers expanding Rome's subway stumbled onto a second-century barracks for imperial guards, its walls covered in frescoes of fierce animals and gladiators, likely morale boosters for soldiers tasked with protecting mercurial emperors. Across the Mediterranean in Turkey, archaeologists recently unearthed a Roman-era mosaic in Antakya depicting a whimsical scene of Narcissus. But with a twist, the mythical figure is surrounded by geometric patterns and animals unlike any other known Roman art, suggesting regional styles were far more diverse than textbooks assumed. Even Britain keeps surprising us. A 2022 excavation in Rutland revealed a 3rd-century mosaic of Homer's Iliad, proving that provincial elites had sophisticated tastes long after Rome's legions withdrew. The real game-changer, though, is how we're reinterpreting old finds with new perspectives. Take the infamous lead pipe poisoning theory. Recent isotope analysis of bones from Roman cemeteries shows lead levels were no higher than in pre-industrial Europeans, forcing us to rethink assumptions about public health. Similarly, re-evaluations of garbage pits in Ostia suggest recycling was widespread, with broken amphorae crushed into concrete and glass melted down for reuse. Even the Coliseum's hypogeum, long thought to be just a backstage for gladiators, is now believed to have hosted elaborate religious rituals before games, based on inscriptions found in 2019 mentioning sacred preparations beneath the sand. Perhaps most exciting are the mysteries still taunting us. The lost books of Livy's history of Rome, the contents of Cleopatra's vanished library, the fate of Caligula's legendary pleasure barges, all could resurface tomorrow in an attic or beneath a farmer's field. With less than 10% of Rome's capital excavated due to modern buildings sitting atop ancient ruins, who knows what's hidden beneath Rome's streets? The recent discovery of Nero's rotating dining room, described by Suetonius but only found in 2020, proves even the most outlandish ancient accounts might be grounded in truth. This isn't just about filling gaps, it's about humility. Every shattered pot or half-buried fresco reminds us that history isn't a locked vault but a living conversation, one where new voices and technologies constantly add to the dialogue. The next time you see a documentary claiming to have Rome figured out, remember, the past has a habit of surprising us when we least expect it. After all, if there's one thing the Romans taught us, it's that the greatest stories are those still being uncovered. From gladiators to emperors, we've shattered the Hollywood myths and uncovered the real Rome, a civilization far more vibrant, contradictory, and human than any sword and sandal epic could capture. Think about it, this was a world where enslaved philosophers taught elite children, where North African emperors ruled from Scottish forts, and where concrete recipes were guarded like state secrets. The next time you see a movie Roman swigging undiluted wine or hear someone blame lead pipes for the empire's fall, you'll know better. But here's the real twist: these myths aren't just harmless Hollywood fluff. They shape how we see history itself, flattening 1,000 years of innovation, struggle, and cultural exchange into tired cliches. Take the humble toga, that symbol of Roman identity we've debunked today. Its myth persists not because it's accurate, but because it fits a neat narrative, one where Rome is either a marble-skinned utopia or a decadent ruin. The truth, Romans were as messy and adaptable as we are. They argued about taxes, botched DIY home repairs, Pompeii's walls are full of them, and sometimes even faked their own military victories on coins when the real ones weren't impressive enough. That's the Rome worth remembering, not a parade of perfect statues, but a living, breathing society that built aqueducts while still believing in werewolves. This isn't just about setting the record straight. It's about reclaiming history from the textbooks and letting it breathe again. Every myth we've busted today, from the Coliseum's naval battles to the Vestal's grim fate, reveals a deeper truth. Rome's real legacy isn't in its marble or its armies, but in its people. The Syrian merchant who traded silk for Baltic amber, the Gaulish soldier who retired to run a British vineyard, the freedwoman who commissioned a tomb declaring herself a self-made success. Their stories are the ones that survived against the odds, scratched into wax tablets or painted on tavern walls. So what's next? The rabbit hole goes deeper. Did you know Romans believed in robot waiters powered by steam? That some gladiators had fan clubs as obsessive as any modern celebrities? Or that their fast food, joint-served dishes we're still trying to recreate today? Hit subscribe and ring the bell, because we're just getting started. History isn't a static pile of facts, it's a conversation, and you're invited to the table. After all, if there's one thing Rome taught us, it's that the best stories aren't the ones handed down by emperors, they're the ones we dig